This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. I still feel sick thinking about it. This happened last summer when I just needed to get away from everything for a night. Work had been brutal. My girlfriend and I had just broken up, and I was feeling claustrophobic in my apartment. So I decided to do what always clears my head, grab my gear and my dog Buck for a quick overnight camping trip. Buck is a black lab shepherd mix, about 70 pounds of pure loyalty. He's been my camping buddy for 4 years now, always excited when he sees me pull out the backpack. That evening was no different. The moment I started gathering supplies, he was right there, tail wagging like crazy. I didn't want to drive far, maybe 40 minutes from home, to this area I'd passed a few times but never explored. Just some public land with a gravel access road cutting through it. Nothing fancy or deep backcountry. I wasn't looking for an expedition, just a night under the stars away from everything. It was already late afternoon when we arrived, around 5 or so. I parked at what looked like an old pull-off spot, grabbed my light pack with just the essentials, tarp, sleeping bag, food for Buck and me, water, basic first aid, and we started walking. Buck was in heaven, nose to the ground, exploring every scent while I looked for a decent flat spot to set up. About 20 minutes in, maybe 400 meters from where I'd parked, I found the perfect spot. A small clearing with 2 sturdy trees spaced just right for my tarp. The area was elevated slightly, with a gentle slope on one side that would keep water away if it rained. I could see my surroundings well, mostly pine trees and some scrub, not too dense. Perfect. I quickly set up my simple shelter, just a tarp secured between the trees at an angle, enough to keep dew off during the night. Collected some rocks to make a small fire pit, gathered wood, and got a modest fire going. Nothing huge, just enough for a little warmth and to heat up the canned stew I'd brought. The sun was setting by then, casting long shadows through the trees. That golden hour light, you know? Buck settled nearby, chewing on a stick, completely content. I remember sitting there thinking how perfect it was, just what I needed. Quiet, peaceful, away from cell service and notifications and the constant noise of my everyday life. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped a bit, but it was still comfortable with my hoodie on. The fire was dying down to coals, and I was getting drowsy. Buck had already curled up next to me, his head resting on my leg. I leaned back against my backpack, looking up at the stars starting to appear. I remember thinking how crystal clear the night was. No clouds, no wind, just stillness and a crescent moon. I must have been dozing off when the first unnatural sounds broke through the quiet. At first, it was just the distant rumble of an engine, which seemed odd given how remote I thought this spot was. I wasn't that concerned, probably just someone driving on the main road. But the sound grew louder, not fading away like I expected. Buck lifted his head, ears perked forward. That's when I realized the engine noise wasn't coming from the direction we'd hiked in from. It was coming from behind us, deeper into what I thought was just uninterrupted forest. The vehicle was getting closer, and it wasn't moving smoothly. The engine was revving high, then dropping, like someone flooring it, then letting off, over and over. I sat up, suddenly wide awake. Buck was on his feet now, looking into the darkness behind our camp, his body tense. The sound was clearly a truck, and it was racing along what must have been a second gravel road that I hadn't known existed. I'd made a rookie mistake. I hadn't properly looked at a map or scouted the area. I just walked in from one road, not realizing there was another one looping around behind. And then I heard them, men's voices, loud, slurred shouting punctuated by bursts of laughter. They were clearly drunk, hooting and hollering over the sound of their truck's engine as it strained over the rough terrain. I couldn't make out words, just the unmistakable sound of intoxicated men having what they thought was fun. My heart rate had already picked up, but what came next made it skyrocket. A sharp crack split the air, unmistakably a gunshot. Then another, and another, 3 or 4 in rapid succession. There was a pause, then several more. They weren't just drunk, they were drunk and shooting guns. I froze for a second, my brain struggling to process what was happening. Buck pressed against my leg, a low growl rising from his throat. Based on the sounds, I estimated they were maybe 200 meters away, possibly less. Close enough that I could hear not just the gunshots, but also the sound of the bullets hitting something. Trees, probably. Or maybe they were shooting at cans or bottles. The realization hit me like ice water. Based on the terrain and where the sounds were coming from, they were firing in my general direction. They had no idea I was there, but that didn't matter. A stray bullet doesn't care if it was meant for you or not. I didn't hesitate after that. Moving as quickly and quietly as possible, I kicked dirt over the remaining embers of my fire, thankful it had already died down mostly. I stuffed my sleeping bag into my backpack haphazardly, not bothering with neatness. The tarp was fast. Just yank the cords free, ball it up, shove it in the side pocket of my pack. More gunshots rang out, closer this time. The truck was still moving, the engine revving as they accelerated down what must have been a pretty rough road. I could hear one of them whooping after each shot, like this was some kind of game. Buck knew something was wrong. He was standing rigid, staring in the direction of the noise. I clipped his leash on and kept him close. The last thing I needed was for him to run toward the commotion or to be mistaken for a deer or coyote by drunk idiots with guns. I had a flashlight but didn't dare use it. Instead, I moved by the faint moonlight, staying low and stepping carefully, Buck tight against my leg. I tried to retrace our path inexactly, heading back toward my car. Each step felt painfully slow, but I forced myself to be methodical. A twisted ankle out here now would be disastrous. More shots fired. I counted 8 in a row this time. They were definitely moving, the truck's engine revving hard, then dropping as they presumably hit rough patches. From the sound, they seemed to be driving roughly parallel to the path I was taking back to my car, but on their road. The thought of our paths potentially intersecting sent cold sweat down my back. I stopped for a moment, crouching behind a fallen log, trying to get my bearings. The moonlight was just enough to see outlines of trees and the vague path ahead. Buck was still tense but quiet, sensing the need for silence. Another burst of gunfire, and this time I actually heard the impact, not far from us. A bullet had struck a tree maybe 30 meters to our right. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. These guys had no clue I was out here, and they were firing wildly into the woods while driving drunk on a back road. I changed our route slightly, veering more to the left, away from where their truck seemed to be. This meant a less direct path back to my car, but it felt safer than continuing on our current trajectory. The ground became uneven, with more underbrush to navigate, but I pushed through, one hand gripping Buck's leash tightly. For a few minutes the gunshots stopped. I could still hear the truck and the men shouting, but they seemed to be getting a bit further away. I allowed myself to hope they were moving on, continuing down their road away from me. Then the engine sound changed. They'd stopped. The voices grew louder, more animated. I froze in place, straining to hear. Were they getting out, setting up to shoot more? I couldn't tell exactly what was happening, but they weren't moving anymore, and that worried me. I resumed my careful retreat, moving as silently as possible. My car couldn't be more than 200 meters away now. Buck was doing amazingly well, staying right with me, not making a sound. More than once, I had to navigate around fallen logs or dense brush, extending our path. The gunfire started again, but this time it was more measured. Single shots, spaced apart. They were aiming at something, not just firing wildly. Each crack made me flinch, my shoulders hunching involuntarily as if I could make myself a smaller target. Finally, I caught sight of what I was sure was the gravel road where I'd parked. Relief washed over me, but I didn't allow myself to rush. More carefully than ever, I moved toward it, hyper-aware of every twig under my feet. The truck's engine roared to life again, and I heard it starting to move. But instead of continuing on, the sound suggested they were turning around. My stomach dropped. They were coming back along the same road. I reached my car just as their headlights became visible through the trees on the parallel road. Fumbling with my keys, I unlocked the door as quietly as possible and helped Buck jump in. I threw my backpack onto the passenger seat, got in, and closed the door with barely a sound. For a second, I just sat there, heart pounding, trying to decide what to do. Their truck was definitely heading back in our direction. The smart move was to leave immediately, but I was terrified they'd see my headlights and, in their drunken state, decide to investigate or follow. I made a split-second decision. Starting my engine, I put the car in gear and began rolling forward slowly, headlights off, using just the moonlight to see the gravel road. It was incredibly nerve-wracking. I could barely make out the road edges, and I was moving at maybe 5 miles per hour, terrified of going off into a ditch. I could see their headlights through the trees now, bouncing wildly as their truck traversed the rough road. They were maybe 100 meters away, roughly parallel to me, but getting closer as the road seemed to converge ahead. Another shot rang out, then another. They were still shooting from the moving vehicle. I heard Buck whine softly in the back seat, and I reached back to reassure him with a quick pat. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably less than a kilometer, I saw what looked like the main road ahead. I allowed myself to speed up slightly, desperate to reach it before the other vehicle got too close. I made it to the junction and turned onto the main road, still without headlights. Only when I was sure I was out of sight of the back road did I finally switch them on and press the accelerator, putting as much distance as possible between me and those drunk shooters. It wasn't until I was almost home that I realized I'd been holding my breath. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, and my shirt was soaked with sweat despite the cool night air. That night taught me some hard lessons about proper site selection and the importance of knowing all access routes to a camping area. What I thought was isolation actually put me dangerously close to exactly the kind of people you never want to encounter in the wilderness. I still go camping regularly, but I never ever set up camp without thoroughly checking maps and scouting the area first. And I've never returned to that particular spot. Some places just aren't worth revisiting, no matter how pretty they might be in the daylight. Story 2. My buddy Jake and I had been friends since high school. We both loved camping and the outdoors, but life got busy after college. Him with his new job at an accounting firm, me with my struggling landscaping business. We promised to make time for at least one camping trip that summer, just like we used to do. Jake's uncle owned this piece of land in rural Georgia, about 2 hours southeast of Atlanta. It wasn't anything fancy, just 40 acres of woods with a small, narrow lake in the middle. The property was completely isolated, surrounded by more woods and accessible only by this bumpy, overgrown dirt road that led to a rusty metal gate with a padlock. Jake had the key from his uncle, who told us to have at it for the weekend. The isolation was the appeal. No other campers, no permits, no designated campsites with fire rings 10 feet from your neighbor. Just us, the woods, and that eerily still lake that couldn't have been more than 70 yards across at its widest point. We arrived late afternoon on a Saturday in early October. The weather was perfect, that sweet spot in Georgia where it's not sweltering anymore, but before the real chill sets in. We unlocked the gate, drove Jake's pickup about half a mile down this increasingly narrow dirt path until it opened to a small clearing about 30 yards from the lake's edge. We spent the afternoon setting up camp, gathering firewood, and fishing a bit. Jake caught 2 decent-sized bass that we cleaned and cooked over the fire for dinner. The whole time we were catching up, talking about life, work, relationships, the usual stuff friends talk about when they finally get time together. I remember thinking how peaceful it was. No cell service, no sounds of traffic or people. Just crickets, frogs, the occasional splash from a fish jumping, and the wind rustling through the pines and oaks. As darkness fell, we settled in around the campfire with a couple beers, looking up at the stars that were becoming more visible by the minute. It must have been around 9 or 10 at night. The fire was burning low, and the night had gotten properly dark, that kind of encompassing darkness you only get miles away from any town. The stars were incredible, like someone had scattered diamond dust across black velvet. The Milky Way was clearly visible, stretching across the sky. We were sitting in our camp chairs, facing the lake. Jake was in the middle of some story about a client at work when he suddenly stopped mid-sentence. "Hey," he said, his voice dropping almost to a whisper. "Do you see that guy over there, across the lake?" I followed where he was pointing, squinting to see through the darkness. At first, I didn't see anything except the black outline of trees against the slightly lighter sky. "What guy? I don't see anyone," I said, leaning forward in my chair. "Right there, behind those trees, there's someone watching us." I was about to laugh it off when my eyes adjusted better. Then I saw it, and not just one. There were faces, many faces, lined up along the opposite shore, partially hidden behind trees and brush, but clearly visible. I counted at least 15, maybe 20 pale faces, unnaturally pale, like the color of uncooked dough. They weren't illuminated by anything I could see, but they seemed to have this faint glow to them, just enough to make them visible in the darkness. They were about the size of human faces, but wrong somehow. The proportions were off. The features were flat, almost like masks, but I could tell they weren't masks. The eyes were too dark, too deep set. No noses I could make out, just shallow indentations. The mouths were thin lines, unmoving. "What the fuck?" I whispered. "What the actual fuck, Jake?" "You see them too?" His voice cracked slightly. "Yeah, they're just watching us." We both froze. Neither of us moved or spoke above a whisper for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only about 5 minutes. The faces didn't move either. They just stared across the lake at us, perfectly still, half hidden behind the trees. The worst part was the silence. There should have been night sounds, insects, frogs, something, but I realized that everything had gone completely quiet. Just the soft crackle of our dying fire and the sound of my own pulse thudding in my ears. I was trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Were they people? Some kind of animal? A trick of the light? But there was no light to create tricks, and they were so clearly Faces, watching us. Jake whispered, "Should we call out to them?" Before I could answer, something changed. All at once, like someone had flipped a switch, the faces disappeared. Not like they ducked behind the trees or walked away. They simply vanished. 1 second they were there, and the next they weren't. The relief lasted maybe half a second before something worse started. From the exact spot where those faces had been, we heard movement. Not small movement like raccoons or possums, heavy, deliberate movement. Branches snapping, undergrowth being crushed. The sounds of large, heavy things moving through the woods on the far side of the lake. In the stillness of the night, with that narrow lake acting like an amphitheater, every sound carried perfectly across the water to us. We could hear footfalls, multiple sets, heavy enough to make the ground vibrate slightly. Whatever they were big, and they were moving. Jake and I looked at each other, and I've never seen such naked fear on another human being's face. I'm sure my expression mirrored his. "The truck," he mouthed, barely making a sound. We both knew what that meant. The truck was our only way out, but to get to it, we'd have to pack up, walk 30 yards to where it was parked, then drive down that narrow dirt path to the gate, get out to unlock the padlock, drive through, then get out again to lock it behind us. Jake's uncle was strict about that last part, but the alternative was staying put, with whatever those things were, potentially making their way around the lake toward us. "They'd have to go all the way around," I whispered. "The lake separates us." As if in answer, we heard a loud splash from across the water. My blood turned to ice. Something, or multiple somethings, had entered the lake. I strained my eyes to see, but the night was too dark. The surface of the water, a black mirror reflecting only fragments of starlight. "They're coming across," Jake whispered, his voice tight with panic. We jumped to our feet simultaneously. The camping gear didn't matter. Nothing mattered except getting to that truck. We had our keys and phones in our pockets. Everything else could stay. With just the dying embers of our fire providing a faint red glow, we stumbled toward where the truck was parked. I kept looking back toward the lake, trying to see if anything was emerging from the water on our side, but it was too dark to tell. The sounds continued, splashing, more breaking branches, and then something else that I still have nightmares about, a soft, wheezing sound, almost like laughter but not quite, carried across the water. We reached the truck, fumbling with the keys, hands shaking so badly Jake dropped them once before managing to unlock it. We practically dove inside, and he started the engine. The headlights came on, illuminating the trees in front of us, but not reaching far enough to show the lake or what might be coming out of it. Jake threw the truck into reverse, backed up until he could turn, then switched to drive and started down the narrow dirt path that led to the gate. The truck bounced violently over roots and ruts, branches scraping against the sides like fingernails. All I could think was, the gate. We have to get through the gate. The drive to the gate couldn't have been more than half a mile, but it felt like 10. Every second I expected something to appear in the headlights or to feel something land on the roof of the truck. I kept checking the side mirrors, but they showed only darkness behind us. When we finally reached the gate, Jake stopped the truck. We sat there for a moment, both breathing hard. "I have to get out to unlock it," he said. I nodded. "I'll come with you." Neither of us moved. "What did we see back there?" he asked, his voice small. "I don't know," I said honestly. "But we need to get through this gate." Finally, with a deep breath, we both opened our doors and stepped out. Jake ran to the padlock with the key ready while I stood by the truck, keeping watch, though I wasn't sure what I was watching for. The woods around us were silent now, which somehow felt even worse than the sounds we'd heard before. Jake unlocked the gate, swung it open, and we both jumped back in the truck. He drove through, then we repeated the process to close and lock the gate behind us. Each second outside the truck felt like an hour, exposed and vulnerable. Once we were back on the main road, we started breathing again. Neither of us spoke for several miles. What was there to say? We had both seen the same impossible thing, and neither of us had an explanation. It's been 11 years, and I've never been camping since that night. Jake and I don't talk about it much, but sometimes when we're having a beer, one of us will get a distant look, and the other knows what he's thinking about. Those pale faces watching us from across the lake, the sounds of heavy bodies moving through underbrush, the splashes in the water. Jake's uncle sold that property a year later. He never asked why we left all our camping gear behind, and we never volunteered the information. To this day, I don't know what we saw. Were they some kind of deformed people living in those woods? Some undiscovered animal? Something else entirely? I've researched local legends, cryptids, everything I could think of, but found nothing that matches what we experienced. All I know is that sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night and everything is quiet, I swear I can hear that soft, wheezing, almost laughter coming from somewhere in the darkness. And I wonder if whatever was watching us that night is still watching, just waiting for me to let my guard down again. Story 3. I've been putting off sharing this for months, but I need to get it off my chest. I still get chills thinking about that night in the Georgia woods last October, and I'm hoping writing it down might help me process what happened. Me and 3 of my buddies, Luke, Devin, and Marcus, had planned this camping trip for weeks. We're all experienced outdoorsmen, or at least we thought we were. We'd picked a remote spot in the Chattahoochee National Forest, about 4 hours from Atlanta, where Marcus's uncle used to hunt. The area was beautiful, tall pines, dense undergrowth, and a small creek that ran through our chosen campsite. We arrived around 2 in the afternoon on a Friday. The weather forecast had predicted mild temperatures, typical for mid-fall in Georgia, maybe dropping to the 40s at night. We set up our tents, gathered firewood, and spent the afternoon fishing in the creek. Devin caught a couple of small trout, which we cooked up for dinner, along with some canned beans and corn we'd brought along. As evening approached, the temperature started dropping way faster than expected. I remember checking my phone's weather app and being surprised to see it was already down to 38 degrees, with predictions of dipping into the 20s overnight. That was unusually cold for October in Georgia, but we weren't worried. We had sleeping bags rated for cold weather, plenty of extra clothes, and a good fire going. We sat around the campfire, trading stories and drinking a few beers until about 11 that night. The woods were eerily quiet. No owls, no distant coyotes, nothing but the occasional crackle from our fire and the soft bubbling of the creek nearby. Eventually, we all turned in, each of us retreating to our respective tents. Luke and I shared one, while Devin and Marcus took the other. I drifted off quickly but kept waking up from the cold. Even in my thermal underwear and inside my sleeping bag, I could feel the bite in the air. My watch showed it was just past 2 in the morning when Luke nudged me. I was already half awake, shivering slightly. "Tom," he whispered, barely audible, "don't make any sudden movements." The seriousness in his voice instantly put me on high alert. I froze, my heart immediately picking up pace. He gestured toward the tent opening with his eyes. From where I was lying, I could see our campfire had burned down to embers, casting just enough light to make out shapes in the darkness. And that's when I saw them. Two massive wild boars were methodically circling the perimeter of our campsite. These weren't your farm pigs or even the smaller wild hogs I'd seen in photos. These things were monsters, easily 150 pounds each, with thick, bristly coats that looked almost black in the dim light. Their muscular shoulders hunched as they moved, and I could make out the gleam of tusks when they turned a certain way. Holy shit, I breathed, barely making a sound. Luke's hand gripped my forearm, warning me to stay silent. We both knew how dangerous wild boars could be. They're surprisingly fast, incredibly strong, and those tusks can slice through flesh like a knife through butter. People have been killed by them. Our tent was about 15 feet from the dying fire. Devin and Marcus's tent was on the opposite side, maybe 20 feet away. I couldn't tell if they were awake or aware of our visitors. One of the boars stopped and lifted its snout, seeming to sniff the air. I held my breath, terrified it had caught our scent. The animal was uncomfortably close to our tent, maybe 10 feet away. If it charged, the thin nylon fabric wouldn't provide any protection whatsoever. I remember thinking about our options. My hunting knife was in my backpack, which was lying near the fire pit. Luke's hatchet, which we'd used to chop kindling, was also out there somewhere. We had no weapons within reach, and making a dash for them would almost certainly trigger an attack. So we lay there, completely still, barely breathing, watching these massive animals through the mesh window of our tent. The minutes felt like hours as the boars continued their circuit around our camp. Then something happened that I still can't fully explain. The larger of the two boars approached our fire pit, where the embers were still glowing red. With deliberate movements, it began to kick dirt onto the fire with its front hooves. Not randomly or by accident, it was methodically extinguishing our fire. The second boar joined in, and together they worked at smothering our embers with dirt and leaves. I've seen animals do some smart things, but this was different. It felt calculated, almost intelligent. They weren't afraid of the fire, they were eliminating it. Luke and I exchanged glances, both of us wide-eyed with disbelief. This wasn't normal animal behavior. Nothing about this felt natural. The temperature had to be in the low 20s by this point. Without the fire, the cold was becoming intense, seeping through my sleeping bag and clothes. But fear kept me from feeling its full effect. Adrenaline was pumping through my veins. For nearly 30 minutes, these boars worked at destroying our fire, kicking dirt and leaves until every last ember was extinguished. The campsite grew darker as our only light source disappeared completely. Now we could barely see the animals, just vague shapes moving in the darkness. When they'd finished with the fire, the boars began investigating our supplies. One nudged at our cooler, pushing it around. The other seemed interested in our backpacks. I watched in silent horror as it used its snout to flip over my pack, the contents spilling out onto the ground. My knife was now fully visible, lying on the dirt, but it might as well have been miles away for all the good it did me. At one point, the larger boar approached our tent again. It stopped just a few feet from the entrance, its breath visible in the cold air. I could hear it snorting, could smell the musky odor of wet fur and mud. Luke and I lay perfectly still, not daring to move a muscle. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure the animal could hear it. The boar stood there for what felt like an eternity, seemingly looking right at us through the tent fabric. Then, without warning, it turned and rejoined its companion. What happened next still makes me shudder. Both boars, having extinguished our fire and examined our camp, simply lined up side by side and stared in our direction for several long minutes. In the dim moonlight, I could just make out their silhouettes, standing perfectly still as if watching us, waiting for something. Then, as if responding to some signal I couldn't perceive, they turned in unison and trotted back into the forest, disappearing into the darkness. The silence that followed was deafening. Luke and I didn't dare speak for several minutes, afraid they might return. Finally, he whispered, "What the fuck was that?" I had no answer. We debated trying to rebuild the fire, but were too terrified to leave the relative safety of our tent. What if they were still out there, just beyond the tree line, waiting for us to expose ourselves? I checked on Devon and Marcus by texting them. They were awake and had seen everything. They were just as freaked out as we were. We agreed to stay in our tents until daylight, keeping in touch via text. The remainder of the night was excruciating. The temperature continued to drop, and without the fire, we were at the mercy of the cold. I couldn't stop shivering, partly from the temperature and partly from lingering fear. Every snapped twig or rustle in the underbrush sent my heart racing. Sleep was impossible. When the first hint of dawn finally appeared, we wasted no time. All four of us emerged from our tents, pale-faced and exhausted. The campsite looked like it had been ransacked, supplies scattered, our fire pit completely covered in dirt and debris. But most disturbing were the tracks, countless hoof prints circling our camp, confirming we hadn't imagined the night's events. We packed up in record time, barely speaking to each other. The unspoken agreement was clear. We needed to get the hell out of there. As we hastily stuffed our gear into our backpacks, Marcus pointed out something that made my blood run cold. "Those aren't normal boar tracks," he said, crouching near the fire pit. "They're too big, and the pattern is wrong." Marcus had hunted with his father and uncle for years. If anyone would know, it was him. We practically jogged back to where we'd parked our cars, constantly looking over our shoulders, jumping at every sound. Only when we were safely inside our vehicles with the engines running did some of the tension begin to ease. On the drive home, we tried to rationalize what we'd seen. Maybe they were just unusually large boars. Maybe they were kicking at the fire out of curiosity or aggression. Maybe the way they extinguished it so methodically was just a coincidence. But deep down, I know what I saw. Those animals acted with purpose. They deliberately put out our fire, leaving us vulnerable to both the cold and to them. They examined our supplies. They watched us. I've spent hours researching wild boar behavior since that night, and nothing I've found explains what we experienced. Some websites mention that boars are intelligent animals, capable of problem solving, but deliberately extinguishing a fire, standing guard-like and watching humans. That's not in any wildlife guide I've read. We've all agreed not to camp in that area again. Devon won't go camping at all anymore. Luke suggested reporting it to the Forest Service, but what would we say? That we were terrorized by suspiciously intelligent wild boars. It's been 6 months, and I still wake up sometimes in a cold sweat, imagining those animals standing outside my bedroom, watching and waiting. I can't shake the feeling that there was something deeply unnatural about that night. Something I still can't explain. I don't know what those creatures really were, or what would have happened if we'd tried to leave our tents while they were still there. And honestly, I don't want to know. Story 4. I've never shared this story before, but I think I'm finally ready. It's been 25 years, but I still get this cold feeling in my gut whenever Christmas approaches. My wife says I'm overprotective of our kids, and maybe I am, but she doesn't know what happened that winter. She doesn't understand why I refused to take our children camping, especially during the holidays. I was 12 years old that December. Our family always went on this annual Christmas camping trip with 4 other families from our neighborhood in Vancouver. It was a tradition that started before I was born. My parents met these other couples in college, and they'd been doing this trip every year since. We'd pack up our cars with winter camping gear, food for several days, and Christmas presents to open together in the wilderness. This particular year, we drove about 5 hours north into British Columbia, to this remote area in a national park I won't name. I remember the roads getting narrower and bumpier as we went deeper into the forest. There were no signs, just my dad following Rick's truck ahead of us, who apparently knew where we were going. By the time we arrived, it was already getting dark. The site wasn't an official campground, just a clearing in the woods that someone in our group had discovered years ago. There were 9 kids total that year, me at 12, my sister Emma, who was 9, and 7 other kids ranging from 7 to 14. The teenagers, Zach and Lisa, considered themselves too cool to hang out with us younger ones, but the rest of us formed this tight little gang. We'd been coming here our whole lives, so we all knew each other really well. Setting up camp was organized chaos. 5 families putting up tents, arranging the communal fire pit, hanging Christmas lights powered by portable generators. My dad and the other adults strung up colored lights between the trees, which looked magical against the snow-covered pines. We helped unpack supplies, collecting firewood, setting up our sleeping bags. By dinner time, we had this cozy little village in the middle of nowhere. The first day was normal. We went sledding down this perfect hill nearby, had snowball fights, and helped prepare food. The adults drank hot cocoa with something extra in it that made them laugh louder as the night went on. We roasted marshmallows and sang Christmas carols. It felt safe, like we were in our own little world. The only rule for us kids was that we couldn't go more than 50 meters from camp without an adult. To make sure we stayed safe, my dad gave us kids a walkie-talkie to carry with us while we played. The adults kept the other one. We were supposed to check in every hour, and they would call us if they needed us back at camp. It seemed reasonable. The forest was dense, and it would be easy to get lost if you wandered too far. Then came Christmas Eve. The weather was perfect, crisp and cold with a fresh layer of snow from the night before. After breakfast, 5 of us kids decided to explore the area within our boundaries. Me, Emma, Jake, who was 11, and the Peterson twins, who were both 10. We took the walkie-talkie and headed into the trees, leaving footprints in the pristine snow. We were playing this game we'd made up called Forest Rangers, where we pretended to track animals and collect evidence of Sasquatch. Jake had brought a small notebook where he was drawing clues we found, weird-shaped branches, unusual tracks in the snow that we sometimes made ourselves, that kind of thing. We were about 40 meters from camp, still within the allowed zone, when the walkie-talkie crackled to life. The sound startled us because the adults rarely called unless it was time for lunch or to check in. We gathered around as I pulled it from my coat pocket, but it wasn't our parents' voices that came through. "Hello, children," said a man's voice, slow and deliberately cheerful. "This is Santa Claus. I've come a bit early, but I can't seem to find your camp. Could you good boys and girls help me find where you're staying?" We all looked at each other with wide eyes. Even at 12, I knew Santa wasn't real, but the younger kids still believed. Jake grabbed the walkie-talkie from me. "Santa, is that really you?" he asked, excitement making his voice crack. "Ho, ho, ho," the voice replied, but there was something off about it. The laugh sounded forced, rehearsed. "Yes, it's me. I have presents for you all, but I'm a bit lost in these woods. Can you tell me which direction to go? Or better yet, maybe you could come meet me and show me the way." Emma was jumping up and down, tugging on my sleeve. "Danny, it's Santa. We have to go help him." I remember feeling this strange sensation in my stomach. Not exactly fear yet, but something unsettling. The voice didn't sound right. It was trying too hard to sound jolly. "Where are you, Santa?" asked one of the twins. "I'm not far," the voice said. "Do you see that big pine tree with the split trunk? I'm just past there. If you come that way, you'll find me and my sack of toys." I knew exactly which tree he was talking about. We'd passed it earlier, and it was definitely beyond our 50-meter boundary. Something felt wrong, but before I could say anything, Jake started heading in that direction. "Wait," I said, grabbing his arm. "We should tell our parents first. They'll want to know Santa's here." Even as I said it, I was already backing up toward camp. The others looked disappointed, but followed my lead. I think it was my serious tone more than my words that convinced them. "We're going to get our parents," I said into the walkie-talkie. "We'll all come help you." There was a pause, then, No need to bother the adults. They're probably busy preparing for Christmas. This can be our little secret, just us. Don't you want to be the ones to surprise everyone by bringing Santa to camp?" That's when I knew for certain something was wrong. I clicked the walkie-talkie off and turned to the others. "Race you guys back to camp," I shouted, already starting to run. The others followed, thinking it was a game. When we burst into the clearing, out of breath and red-faced, the adults were sitting around the fire, drinking coffee. My dad looked up, surprised to see us back so soon. "Mom, Dad," Emma shouted before I could stop her. "Santa's in the woods and he needs help finding our camp." I thrust the walkie-talkie at my father. Someone was talking to us on this. He said he was Santa and wanted us to go meet him at the split tree. I'll never forget how my father's face changed. The relaxed smile vanished, replaced by something I'd never seen before, a mixture of fear and rage. He grabbed the walkie-talkie and exchanged glances with the other adults. My mom immediately gathered all of us kids together while the men stood up. "Everyone back to camp now," Rick called out loudly, his voice carrying through the trees. "Zach, Lisa, get back here immediately." He was calling for the teenagers who had gone off on their own. The next few minutes were a blur of activity. The adults spoke in hushed, urgent tones, forming a tight circle away from us kids. I caught fragments. "How far?" "Did they say where exactly?" "Call the Rangers?" "No signal out here." My mom kept her arm around me and Emma, pulling us close. "You did the right thing coming back to tell us," she whispered. Her hand was trembling against my shoulder. Rick and my dad took the walkie-talkie and walked to the edge of our campsite, facing the woods. My dad clicked it on. "This is Mark Wilson," he said in a voice I'd never heard him use before. "We are 9 adults at this campsite, including 2 former military. We have already radioed the park rangers with our coordinates, and they're on their way. I suggest you move on immediately." There was no response. The teenagers returned, confused by the sudden tension. The adults finally explained that someone was in the woods, using our frequency to talk to us, possibly trying to lure us away from camp. They didn't say more than that to us kids, but their actions spoke volumes. Within minutes, our Christmas camping trip transformed. The men took turns keeping watch at the perimeter of our site. They built up the fire bigger than usual, creating a bright circle of light around our camp. All the Christmas cheer evaporated. The women kept us close, organizing games inside the largest tent instead of letting us play in the snow. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every crack of a branch made me jerk awake. I kept picturing a stranger hiding in the darkness beyond our tents, watching us. In the adjacent sleeping bag, my dad wasn't sleeping either. I could tell by his breathing. He had a baseball bat lying next to him that hadn't been there the night before. Christmas morning was subdued. We still opened presents, but the adults' smiles were forced. They wouldn't let us out of their sight, even to use the bathroom. Someone always went with us. The walkie-talkies stayed turned off, locked in Rick's truck. By midday on December 26th, the adults had made the decision to pack up and leave 2 days earlier than planned. Nobody complained. Even we kids sensed the wrongness in the air. As we drove away, I looked back at our abandoned campsite, the half-burned logs in the fire pit, the trampled snow, the strings of Christmas lights we'd left behind in our hurry to leave. It wasn't until I was 16 that I understood what had really happened. I found the old walkie-talkie in our garage while looking for camping gear for a school trip. When I asked my dad about that Christmas, he finally told me the truth. Someone had been in those woods, with us. Someone who knew we had children. Someone who had been watching us long enough to know about our walkie-talkies and was close enough to transmit on our frequency. Someone who was trying to separate us kids from our parents. The park rangers later told my dad there had been no other registered campers in that section of the park. Whoever it was shouldn't have been there at all. They never found out who it was. I'm 37 now, with 3 kids of my own. Each Christmas, when my wife suggests we should try camping someday, I find an excuse. I can't explain to her why the thought of my children playing in remote woods fills me with dread. I can't make her understand how thin the barrier is between safety and danger, how predators can hide behind friendly voices, how close we came to walking toward that voice instead of away from it. Some nights I still dream about it, that false, cheerful voice crackling through the walkie-talkie, calling us deeper into the trees. And I wonder what would have happened if we'd gone to meet Santa that day. Story 5. I keep telling myself I'm done with this story, that after 33 years, I need to let it go. But every time I think I've put it behind me, something drags me back. A random carnival advertisement, a horror movie preview, or worst of all, those damn seasonal Halloween stores with their rows of masks. It started with a phone call from Jason last week. We haven't spoken in almost 2 years, but as soon as I heard his voice, I knew exactly why he was calling. I dreamt about him again, he said, without even saying hello. No need to specify who him was. The clown. Always the damn clown. I grew up in Pinewood Creek, a small suburban development that backed up to about 40 acres of woods in eastern Pennsylvania. It wasn't anything special, just your typical middle-class neighborhood built in the late 70s. Ranch-style homes with attached garages and kidney-shaped pools for the families who could afford them. The real attraction for us kids was those woods. Jason lived 3 houses down from me. We were inseparable from the time we were old enough to play outside unsupervised. Our mothers would kick us out after breakfast during summers with the simple instruction to be home by dinner. The woods became our kingdom. We built forts, imagined we were explorers mapping uncharted territory, staged elaborate wars with invisible enemies. There were actual hiking trails running through parts of it, but we preferred to forge our own paths, crawling under fallen trees and wading through the shallow creek that gave our neighborhood its name. My family moved away when I was 7. Dad got transferred to Ohio for work, one of those can't pass it up opportunities that parents make sound exciting while you sob into your pillow at night. We still visited Pinewood Creek a couple times a year, though. My grandmother lived about 20 minutes away, so whenever we'd go see her, I'd beg my parents to swing by so Jason and I could hang out. The visit I'm thinking about happened when we were 13. It was summer, hot and sticky as Pennsylvania gets in July. I remember being excited about seeing Jason since it had been almost a year since our last visit. We were at that age where interests change quickly, and I was worried we might have grown apart. But within minutes of seeing each other, it was like I'd never left. We immediately headed for the woods. The trails seemed smaller, less mysterious than I remembered, but still comfortably familiar. We were deep in conversation about some video game when Jason suddenly got quiet. "Hey, do you remember that time we saw the clown?" he asked, trying to sound casual, but his voice had this weird edge to it. I laughed. "What clown?" He stopped walking and stared at me. "The clown, in the woods. You seriously don't remember?" I thought he was messing with me, trying to set up some elaborate joke. "Nope, never saw any clown." His face went sort of pale. "We were like 6, maybe 7, just before you moved. We were running down that trail near the big oak with the split trunk, and we came around the bend, and there was this clown just standing there, staring at us." I felt a small chill despite the summer heat. "You sure that wasn't a dream or something?" "No way," Jason insisted. "We both saw him. We looked at each other. I remember your eyes were so wide, and then we just turned and ran all the way back to my house. We were totally freaking out. I genuinely had no memory of this. Maybe it was one of those inflatable clown punching toys. Someone could have hung it from a tree as a prank." Jason shook his head firmly. "It wasn't a toy. It was a person in a full clown costume. White face, red nose, colorful wig, the works. And he didn't move or say anything, just stood there." I shrugged it off, but it bothered me that I couldn't remember something that had apparently terrified us both. Weird that I don't remember that at all. "Well, you did hit your head pretty bad sledding that winter," Jason said. "Maybe that's why." I had forgotten about that too, a sledding accident where I'd crashed into a tree and gotten a concussion. My mom had been paranoid about brain damage for months afterward. We changed the subject and spent the rest of the day catching up, but I could tell the clown thing was still nagging at Jason. Before I left that evening, he said, "Just think about it, okay? Maybe it'll come back to you." During our visit the next year, Jason brought it up again, and the year after that. Each time, he told the story exactly the same way, with the same details, the location, our reactions, how we ran away. His consistency was unsettling. Either this had really happened, or Jason had somehow convinced himself it had. By the time we were 16, I started having flashes of what felt like memories, a glimpse of something bright and colorful against the dull brown of the forest floor, the feeling of my stomach dropping, the sound of our sneakers pounding against dirt as we ran. But I couldn't tell if these were actual memories or just images my brain had created from hearing Jason's story so many times. After high school, our visits became less frequent. I went to college in Michigan. Jason stayed local. We'd catch up when I came home for holidays, but our friendship gradually shifted to occasional phone calls and later social media updates. Yet somehow, the clown always came up. Even in our 30s, married with kids of our own, Jason would inevitably ask, "Remember that clown?" Like it was a shared trauma we'd never fully processed. Last summer, My family and I visited my parents, who had retired back to Pennsylvania. Jason and I met for coffee. We're 40 now, with graying hair and reading glasses, but as soon as we sat down, I could tell from his expression where the conversation was heading. "I went back to the woods last month," he said, stirring his coffee unnecessarily. "They're developing part of it for new houses." "That's a shame," I said, thinking of our childhood playground disappearing under concrete foundations. "I walked our old trails," he continued, "found that bend in the path." I sighed. "Jason, I know, you think I'm obsessed, but standing there again, I swear I could feel it, like he might still be there, waiting." I've known Jason long enough to see when he's genuinely disturbed, and despite the years that had passed, the clown story still unsettled him deeply. "Have you ever considered," I said carefully, "that maybe there wasn't actually a clown? That maybe we saw something else and your mind just filled in the details over time?" Jason looked at me like I'd slapped him. "You were there. You saw him too. We talked about it right afterward." I rubbed my temples. "I honestly don't remember that conversation either. The first I heard about any clown was when we were 13. "That's not possible," Jason insisted. His coffee sat forgotten, getting cold. "We ran straight to my house. My mom made us hot chocolate because we were so shaken up. We sat at the kitchen counter and promised never to tell any adults because they'd say we were making it up." That detail was new. In all the times Jason had told this story, he'd never mentioned hot chocolate or a pact of silence. I felt uneasy. Either he was elaborating on his fabrication, or he was remembering more details of something that actually happened. "Look," I said, "memories are tricky. We both know that. Studies show people can form false memories, especially if they're suggested to them repeatedly." Jason leaned forward, lowering his voice, even though no one in the coffee shop was paying attention to two middle-aged guys having what looked like a normal conversation. "I found something when I went back," he said, "near where we saw him." I waited, a knot forming in my stomach. An old Polaroid, faded, water-damaged, but you can still make out what it is. He pulled out his phone, tapped the screen a few times, then slid it across the table to me. The photo showed a small clearing in woods that looked familiar. The image quality was poor, faded and bleached by time and elements. But in the center, partially obscured by tree branches, was a blurry figure. It was standing upright, with what could be interpreted as oversized shoes and a bulbous head. "This doesn't prove anything," I said, sliding the phone back. "It's too degraded. Could be anyone, a hiker, someone dumping trash. In a clearing half a mile from any trail, wearing those shoes?" Jason took his phone back, staring at the image. "I found it tucked into a split in a tree trunk, like someone wanted it to be found eventually." I felt a cold sensation creeping up my spine. "So, what are you saying? Someone was stalking us, photographing us?" "No, I'm saying we saw something that day. Something that wasn't supposed to be there." Jason pocketed his phone. "And I think part of you remembers it too. That's the thing that scares me most. Part of me does feel like I remember. Not just snippets anymore, but almost a complete scene, running through the woods, laughing, then suddenly stopping. The strange silence, the figure standing perfectly still among the trees, face chalk white against the forest shadows. The absolute wrongness of finding something so out of place in our sanctuary. But I can't trust these memories. They've developed over decades of Jason's repetition, gaining detail and clarity with each retelling. And yet, sometimes late at night, I wake up from dreams where I'm small again, running through those woods, the sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps following behind me. The worst part is, I don't know what terrifies me more. The possibility that my best friend has clung to a delusion for 33 years, or the possibility that he hasn't, that something was actually there in those woods, watching us, that my brain protected me by burying the memory, while Jason has been carrying it alone all these years. After that coffee meeting, I started having nightmares. In them, I'm always back in those woods, but I'm my current age. I'm looking for something, though I don't know what. Then I hear carnival music, faint and distorted. I follow it to that bend in the trail, and there he is, not moving, not speaking, just waiting, like he's been there all along. I want to dismiss all this as imagination run wild, but last night, going through some old boxes in my parents' attic, I found a journal I kept when I was 7. Most entries were what you'd expect from a kid, complaints about homework, excitement over a new toy. But the final entry, dated 3 days before we moved away from Pinewood Creek, consisted of a single line. Me and Jason promised never to go back to the split oak tree. I don't remember writing it. I don't remember why, but I haven't slept since I found it, and I can't stop wondering what else I've forgotten. Story 6. I still wake up in cold sweats sometimes. It's been 3 months since our trip to the Rockies, but I can't shake the feeling that we were being hunted. I've gone over it 1,000 times in my head, trying to make sense of what happened, but I still don't have answers. My name's Ethan. I'm 32, and until this past summer, I considered myself an experienced hiker. My friends and I had been planning this 4-day trek through the backcountry for months. Me, Jess, Mike, and Kyle spent weeks checking our gear, mapping routes, and reading about the area. It was supposed to be challenging, but rewarding, the kind of trip we'd talk about for years. The first day was perfect. We hit the trailhead around 7 in the morning. The weather was crisp but not cold, with clear blue skies stretching over the pine forests and rocky outcroppings. The trail started easy enough, winding through dense woods before opening up to those breathtaking mountain views. We were making good time, stopping only for water breaks and to snack on trail mix. Everyone was in high spirits. This was worth taking the days off work, Jess kept saying, snapping photos of everything. She'd been stressed about a big project deadline, but finally disconnected once we lost cell service about an hour in. By late afternoon, we'd reached our first planned campsite. It was this perfect little clearing nestled between 2 ridges, with a view of the peaks that made you feel tiny in the best possible way. Mike and I set up the tents, while Kyle got the portable stove going and Jess filtered water from a nearby stream. We ate freeze-dried pasta as the sun set, painting the jagged peaks in orange and purple. It felt earned, you know, that bone-deep satisfaction of physical exhaustion mixed with the reward of being somewhere few people ever see. We turned in early, around 9, exhausted from the hike but excited for the days ahead. I fell asleep almost immediately in the tent I shared with Kyle. I'm not sure what time it was when I first heard it. Maybe 2 or 3 in the morning? I jolted awake, my heart already racing before my brain could process why. Then it came again, this sound that started as a high-pitched wail and morphed into something else. It wasn't an animal I recognized, and I've heard coyotes, wolves, even mountain lions before. This was wrong. It sounded almost human, but distorted, like someone screaming through a broken radio. It echoed off the cliff faces, making it impossible to pinpoint where it was coming from. I sat up in my sleeping bag. "Kyle," I whispered, "you hear that?" He was already awake, staring at the tent ceiling. "What the hell is that?" The sound came again, distant but clear. A scream that started low and climbed impossibly high before breaking into this chattering noise that made the hair on my neck stand up. Mountain lion? Kyle suggested, but neither of us believed it. We heard rustling from the other tent. Mike poked his head into ours a second later. "You guys hearing this shit?" His face looked pale in the beam of his headlamp. We stayed up for almost an hour, listening as the screams continued at weirdly regular intervals, about 15 minutes apart. They never seemed to get closer or further away, just present, somewhere in the darkness beyond our camp. Eventually they stopped, and we drifted back into uneasy sleep. The next morning, no one mentioned the sounds until we were breaking down camp. Jess finally brought it up while rolling her sleeping bag. "So we're all just going to pretend we didn't hear those freaky screams all night." We laughed nervously and traded theories. Wolves, a mountain lion in heat, maybe even the wind playing tricks through the rock formations. None of us wanted to admit how unsettled we really were. The second day's hike was harder, with steeper elevation gains and rockier terrain. The weather held, but there was a tension in our group that hadn't been there before. We talked less, each lost in our own thoughts. I kept scanning the ridgelines, half expecting to see I don't know what. We reached our second campsite around 4 in the afternoon. It was higher up, more exposed, with fewer trees and a panoramic view of the valley we'd climbed out of. Beautiful, but I found myself wishing for the shelter of the previous night's forest. We went through the motions, setting up camp, filtering water, preparing food. But the easy laughter of the first day was gone. As darkness fell, I could feel everyone's anxiety rising, though no one said it out loud. That night, it started earlier. We were still sitting around our little camp stove when the first scream cut through the twilight. Closer this time, much closer. And now there was no mistaking it. Whatever was making that sound was heading in our direction. "That's not an animal," Jess said quietly, her hands gripping her mug so tight her knuckles were white. "It has to be," Mike insisted. "Maybe it's injured." But an injured animal doesn't scream at regular intervals for hours. An injured animal doesn't sound like it's trying to mimic human vocalizations, but getting it horribly wrong. None of us slept much that night. The screams continued until almost dawn, sometimes seeming to come from directly above us on the ridge, sometimes from the valley below. I dozed off around 5 only to be startled awake by Kyle shaking my shoulder at 7. "Guys want to check out the ridge," he said. "See if we can figure out what's making those sounds." It was a bad idea. I knew it was a bad idea. But sitting around waiting for another night of that psychological torture seemed worse. After a quick breakfast, we secured our campsite and hiked up toward the ridge, where most of the screams had seemed to originate. It was a brutal climb, with loose shale that slipped under our boots and patches, where we had to use our hands to scramble up the steep incline. We reached the top around 11 in the morning. The ridge flattened out into a small plateau maybe 50 yards across before dropping off sharply on the other side. And that's where we found it, a campsite, or what was left of one. The tent was shredded, pieces of blue and gray nylon flapping in the wind or half buried in dirt. An overturned backpack had spilled its contents across the rocky ground, a water bottle, a crushed package of beef jerky, a paperback novel with its pages fluttering. A sleeping bag lay open, and when I touched it, I jerked my hand back immediately. "It's still warm," I said, my voice sounding strange even to myself. That's when Mike pointed to the trail of blood. Not a lot, just dark droplets leading toward the edge of the ridge. We followed it silently, each step heavier than the last. The drops got larger as we approached the precipice, ending in a small pool right at the edge. I looked over, expecting, God, I don't know what I was expecting. A body? More blood? There was nothing. Just a sheer drop of at least 200 feet to a rocky slope below. "We need to go," Jess said firmly. "Now." "Shouldn't we look for whoever was here?" Kyle asked, but his voice trembled. "Look at this place," Mike gestured around. "No footprints except ours coming up. The sleeping bag is still warm, but there's no one here. Something is very wrong." We practically ran back down to our camp, a descent that should have taken an hour, but we managed in 30 minutes, slipping and sliding on loose rock, grabbing at branches to keep from falling. No one spoke. What was there to say? Back at camp, we had a hurried discussion about whether to pack up and try to hike out, but it was already early afternoon. We wouldn't make it back to the trailhead before dark, and none of us wanted to be on those narrow trails at night. "One more night," Mike said. "We stick together, keep watch in shifts, and head out at first light." We built up the fire higher than necessary, creating a circle of light that pushed back the growing shadows. As darkness fell, I found myself jumping at every snapping twig or rustle of leaves, but strangely, no screams came. I took the first watch, sitting with my back to the fire and staring into the darkness. Jess, Mike, and Kyle retreated to their tents, but I doubt any of them slept. The silence felt almost worse than the screams had, heavy with anticipation. My watch ended at midnight, and Mike took over. I crawled into my tent but left my hiking boots on, just in case. I must have dozed off because suddenly I was wide awake, heart pounding, though I wasn't sure what had woken me. I checked my watch, 2:15 a.m., then I heard it. Not screams this time, but footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps circling our camp. The sound of weight being carefully placed, then shifted on the forest floor. Whoever or whatever it was, they were moving just beyond the firelight. I fumbled for my flashlight and unzipped the tent, poking my head out. Mike was sitting rigid by the fire, his eyes wide and fixed on the darkness. He raised a finger to his lips when he saw me. The footsteps continued their methodical circuit around our campsite. I scanned the trees with my light, but saw nothing, just shadows and more shadows. But the footsteps continued, unhurried, unworried about being detected. I slipped out of the tent and moved to sit beside Mike. "How long?" I whispered. 10 minutes, he mouthed back. "It won't come into the light." Another circuit, then another. Whatever was out there was toying with us. "Wake the others," I whispered, quietly. Mike nodded and crawled to the other tent while I kept my eyes fixed on the darkness. Jess and Kyle emerged a minute later, moving silently to join us by the fire. "What do we do?" Jess asked, her voice barely audible. Before anyone could answer, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was worse. Had it left, or was it watching us, waiting? Then something hit the side of my tent, a heavy thud followed by the sound of fabric tearing. We all jumped up. I raised my flashlight, catching just a glimpse of something ducking behind a tree. Something too tall to be an animal, moving in a jerky, unnatural gait. "We're leaving," I said. "Now." No one argued. We grabbed only what we absolutely needed: water, some food, flashlights. The rest we left behind. We hit the trail at a near run, using our lights to find the path back toward the trailhead. It should have been suicide to navigate those trails at night, but fear is a powerful motivator. We kept up a punishing pace for hours, jumping at shadows and the normal sounds of the forest. Dawn broke as we descended the final switchbacks, the trailhead parking lot visible below us. We practically collapsed when we reached our car, the adrenaline that had kept us going finally draining away. It was only when we reached the ranger station that we learned we weren't the first to experience something strange in that area. A ranger told us they were searching for a couple who'd gone missing 3 days earlier. Their campsite had been found intact except for signs of a hasty departure. They'd left most of their gear behind. I haven't been hiking since. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night thinking I hear those footsteps circling my house. I keep telling myself it was a person, some twisted individual who gets off on terrorizing hikers. Because the alternative, I don't know what was watching us that night. I don't know what circles campsites in the darkness, testing boundaries, demonstrating control. But I know it's still out there, waiting for the next group of hikers who think they're prepared for the wilderness. They're not. We never were. Story 7. I still don't like going into the woods behind Shane's house. It's been 4 years, but just thinking about it makes my heart race. I'm 19 now, but back when I was 15, me and my friends found something in those woods that we thought was the coolest discovery ever. Turns out, it was the biggest mistake we ever made. It happened during summer break before sophomore year. Me, Shane, Devin, and Tyler were hanging out at Shane's place like we did most weekends. His parents had this big property that backed up to about 40 acres of forest, and we were always looking for stuff to do out there. We'd built forts before, had airsoft battles, the usual stuff bored teenagers do. That day started normal enough. It was late June, hot as hell, and we were complaining about being bored when Shane mentioned he'd seen something weird deep in the woods while riding his four-wheeler the week before. It looked like concrete walls or something, he said, grabbing a Coke from his fridge. Probably some old foundation, but it's pretty big. That was all it took. Within 20 minutes, we had backpacks filled with snacks, water bottles, Shane's dad's hatchets, and Tyler's machete that his uncle had given him, which his mom would have freaked if she knew he had it. Shane told his mom we were going exploring, and she just waved us off with the usual "be back before dark" warning. The hike took almost an hour. We followed this barely there trail that eventually disappeared completely, and Shane led us using landmarks he remembered from his ride. It was one of those forests that gets denser the further in you go, with trees so tall they block out most of the sunlight. By the time Shane stopped and pointed ahead saying, "There it is," we were all sweaty and covered in bug bites. What we found wasn't just some small foundation, it was an actual structure. Concrete walls about 8 feet high forming a rectangle maybe 30 by 20 feet. One wall had partially collapsed and there was no roof. The whole thing was covered in thick vines and moss, with small trees and brush growing all around it, like nature was trying to swallow it back up. "What the hell is this place?" I remember asking, my voice echoing slightly inside the structure. "Bomb shelter, maybe? Or some kind of storage building?" Devin suggested, already climbing over part of the collapsed wall. None of us actually knew, but we all silently agreed it didn't matter. We'd found something abandoned and hidden, and in that moment, it became ours. We spent the next few hours clearing it out. Using the hatchets and Tyler's machete, we hacked away at the vines and small trees growing inside. We dragged fallen branches out and cleared a space in the center where we could sit. The concrete floor was cracked but mostly intact. In one corner, we found what looked like the remains of an old metal door, rusted beyond recognition. By mid-afternoon, we'd transformed the space. We arranged some logs as seats around a small fire pit we'd made in the center. Shane had brought his lighter, and we gathered dry wood to start a small fire, not caring about the heat. It was our place now, our ruins, our hideout. We sat there, eating Doritos and drinking warm sodas, feeling like we'd discovered something no one else knew about. Tyler kept talking about how we should bring sleeping bags next time and camp out. Dude, this is way better than that crappy treehouse we tried to build last summer, Shane said, poking at our small fire with a stick. I remember looking up at the square of blue sky visible above us, surrounded by the concrete walls covered in decades of graffiti and moss, and feeling this weird sense of ownership, like we'd claimed something abandoned by the world and made it ours again. It was around 5 o'clock when I needed to pee. We'd been there for hours, and all those sodas had caught up with me. "I'm gonna head back to your house to use the bathroom," I told Shane, standing up and brushing dirt off my jeans. "Just go in the woods, man," Tyler said, laughing. "Nah, I gotta take a dump too," I lied. Truth was, I just didn't like the idea of dropping my pants out there with all the poison ivy around. "Whatever, don't get lost," Shane said, tossing another stick into our fire. I grabbed my phone as a flashlight just in case it got dark and headed out through the gap in the wall we'd been using as an entrance. The path back wasn't complicated, just follow our trampled trail through the underbrush until I hit the more established path that led to Shane's backyard. I'd been walking for maybe 5 minutes when I first heard it. Footsteps behind me, crunching on leaves and twigs. I stopped immediately, and the sound stopped too. My first thought was that one of my friends was following me, trying to scare me. "Very funny, guys," I called out, turning around. But there was no one there, just the dense trees and undergrowth swaying slightly in the breeze. I started walking again, a little faster this time. After a few steps, the footsteps behind me started again, heavier than before, deliberate, and definitely not an echo of my own. I stopped again. So did the footsteps. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking slightly. No answer. My heart was beating faster now. I told myself it was probably just an animal. A deer, maybe, though deer usually run away when they hear humans. Or maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me in the fading daylight. I turned and kept walking, picking up my pace. The footsteps resumed, matching my speed. I stopped again. They stopped. I took 3 quick steps. 3 quick steps followed behind me. That's when I knew someone was there. Someone was following me, mimicking my movements, staying just out of sight. Fear shot through me like electricity. I started running, no longer caring about the direction. Branches whipped at my face and arms as I crashed through the underbrush. Behind me, the footsteps broke into a run too, no longer trying to hide. Somehow I found my way back to the ruins. I burst through the entrance, gasping for breath, my face probably white as a sheet. "Whoa, what happened to you?" Devin asked, standing up when he saw me. "There's someone out there," I panted, pointing back toward the woods. Someone followed me. They all looked at me like I was crazy at first. "Dude, it was probably just a deer," Tyler said, echoing my own earlier thought. "No," I insisted. "They were matching my steps. They would stop when I stopped, run when I ran." Shane looked concerned now. "Like an actual person?" I nodded, still trying to catch my breath. "I didn't see them, but someone's out there." We all went quiet, listening to the forest around us. For a few moments, there was nothing but the sound of our small fire crackling and birds in the distance. Then we heard it, a distinct metallic sound, like someone dragging something metal across the outside concrete wall of our hideout. It wasn't loud, but in that moment of silence, it might as well have been a gunshot. We all froze, eyes wide, looking at each other. "What the fuck was that?" Tyler whispered. The sound came again. Scrape. like a piece of metal being dragged slowly across rough concrete. Deliberate, meant to be heard. "Hello?" Shane called out, trying to sound brave, but his voice shook. "Who's out there?" No answer. Just another scraping sound, this time on a different wall. Whatever it was moving around the perimeter of our hideout. "Maybe it's just some other kids," Devin suggested weakly, "playing a joke or something." But we all knew it wasn't a joke. The way the scraping moved slowly, methodically around the walls, it felt threatening, like whoever was out there was letting us know they had us surrounded. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice barely audible. "But they're out there," Shane whispered back. The scraping stopped. Then, clear as day, we heard footsteps circling the structure. Slow, heavy footsteps on the leaf-covered ground, making a complete circuit around our hideout. Tyler grabbed his machete. "I say we all run for it together, back to Shane's house." We quickly gathered our stuff. Tyler kicked dirt over our fire to put it out, and we huddled by the entrance. The footsteps had stopped, but we could feel it. Someone was waiting out there. "On 3, Shane whispered. 1, 2, 3. We burst out of the ruins together, running in a tight group back toward the path. And that's when we heard it. Footsteps behind us, crashing through the underbrush, not trying to be stealthy anymore, just following, pursuing. None of us looked back. We just ran, tripping over roots and fallen branches, scratching ourselves on thorns. I remember the burning in my lungs, the absolute terror of knowing someone was chasing us through those woods. The path seemed 10 times longer than when we'd come in. Every shadow between the trees looked like a person. Every rustle of leaves sounded like footsteps. We finally broke through the tree line into Shane's backyard, all of us gasping for breath. Only then did we stop and turn around, staring back at the dark wall of trees we'd just emerged from. For a moment there was nothing. Then, at the edge of the woods, a figure stepped partway out from behind a tree. I couldn't make out a face. They were wearing a dark hoodie pulled up, but I could tell it was an adult, taller than any of us. They just stood there, half hidden by the tree, watching us. "Who is that?" Shane said, his voice cracking. Nobody answered. We all just stared back, frozen in place. The figure raised one hand slowly, not in a wave, but more like they were acknowledging us, like they were saying, "I see you. I know who you are." Then they stepped back behind the tree and disappeared into the woods. We sprinted the rest of the way to Shane's house and locked ourselves inside. Shane's mom found us all pale and shaking in the living room. We made up some story about seeing a bear, which led to her calling the local wildlife authority. Of course, they found nothing when they checked the next day. We never went back to those ruins, never even talked about going back. Whatever that person wanted, whether they were some homeless person who lived out there or a hunter annoyed by teenagers or something worse, we didn't want to find out. Sometimes I still think about what might have happened if I had gone back to the ruins alone that day instead of running. Or what might have happened if we hadn't all run together. Were they just trying to scare us away from their territory? Or did they have worse intentions? Shane's family moved away last year, and I haven't been back to those woods since that day. But sometimes when I'm alone in my room at night, I swear I can hear that slow metallic scraping sound, and I wonder if they're still out there, waiting in those ruins we thought were ours, but never really were. Story 8. I still get goosebumps thinking about what happened last month. I've been debating whether to share this at all, but I need to get it off my chest. I'm a freelance graphic designer who's been feeling pretty burnt out lately. My apartment in Sacramento has thin walls, and my neighbors aren't exactly quiet. So I decided to book a cabin in Northern California for 3 weeks, somewhere isolated where I could recharge and focus on some projects without distractions. I found this place online that seemed perfect. It was this small, rustic cabin surrounded by pine trees in a clearing, about 20 miles from the nearest town. The listing mentioned the closest neighbor was half a mile away. Perfect. The photos showed a cozy interior with a wood stove, a small kitchen, and a desk by the window overlooking the forest. The owner, an older guy named Bill, seemed nice enough over email. He gave me directions and told me where to find the key. When I arrived, it was exactly what I wanted. One main room, with a kitchenette, a small bathroom, and a loft bedroom accessible by ladder. The place smelled like pine and had that peaceful quiet you can only find when you're truly away from everything. No TV, spotty cell service, just me, my laptop, and nature. The first few days were amazing. I'd wake up early, make coffee, and work for a few hours before taking afternoon hikes. I felt more productive than I had in months. The weather was perfect, cool but sunny during the day, chilly enough at night to justify a fire in the wood stove. On the fourth day, I decided to explore further into the woods. There was a creek about 15 minutes from my cabin that I'd been following. The water was crystal clear, and I could see small fish darting around. I followed it upstream for maybe half an hour when I noticed something through the trees. Another cabin. This one looked abandoned. Part of the roof had collapsed, and the windows were either broken or boarded up. I'm naturally curious, sometimes to a fault, so I decided to check it out. The door was hanging off its hinges, and when I pushed it open, it made this awful creaking sound that echoed through the trees. Inside, everything was covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. There was moldy furniture, a broken table in what must have been the kitchen, and faded wallpaper peeling off in strips. What really caught my attention were the family photographs still hanging on the walls. They looked like they were from the 90s based on the clothes and hairstyles. A mom, dad, teenage boy, and a younger girl, maybe around 10. One photo in particular stood out. A family portrait where they were all smiling in front of the cabin, but the corner was partially burned, like someone had held a lighter to it. I don't know why, but it made me extremely uneasy. I took a few pictures with my phone and left, feeling like I was intruding on something I shouldn't have been. That night, back at my cabin, I couldn't stop thinking about the abandoned place. Who were those people? Why had they left so suddenly that they didn't even take their family photos? I tried to research it using my laptop, but the internet connection was too weak. The next day, I drove into town and went to the local library. The librarian was this older woman with glasses on a chain around her neck. When I mentioned the abandoned cabin by the creek, her expression changed immediately. "You found the Red Man place," she said, not as a question, but as a statement. She pulled up some local newspaper archives on the computer. As I read through the articles, my blood ran cold. In 2002, Carla Redman, her 17-year-old son James, and James's friend Brandon were all murdered in that cabin. The daughter, Leah, who was 12 at the time, went missing. Her remains were found 5 years later, buried in the woods about a mile from the property. What freaked me out the most was that despite there being neighboring cabins within half a mile or so, no one reported hearing anything that night. No screams, no gunshots, nothing. The power had gone out in the area due to a storm, and by the time anyone checked on the family, days had passed. The case went cold for years until Leah's remains were discovered by hikers. The articles didn't give many details about how they died, just that it was brutal and methodical. I felt sick. I had been walking around touching things in a place where an entire family had been slaughtered. Those smiling faces in the photos, all dead in the most horrible way. I drove back to my cabin feeling deeply unsettled. The woods that had seemed so peaceful now felt ominous. Every shadow, every sound took on new meaning. I considered packing up and leaving right then, but I told myself I was being ridiculous. The murders happened 20 years ago. There was no reason to be afraid now. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The wind had picked up, making the branches scrape against the roof of the cabin. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up suddenly, my heart racing. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me, but then I heard it, footsteps outside. Not animal footsteps, human, slow, deliberate steps circling the cabin. I froze, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped at my bedroom window. I could see a dark shape through the curtains, just standing there. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or call out. After what felt like an eternity, the figure moved away and the footsteps receded into the distance. I didn't sleep another minute that night. I sat up in bed with my pocket knife clutched in my hand until dawn, when exhaustion finally overtook my fear and I dozed off for maybe an hour. When I woke up, the morning was bright and sunny, making the terror of the night seem almost like a bad dream. Almost. I knew what I'd heard. I made myself coffee with shaking hands and decided to check outside. That's when I saw them. Boot prints in the soft earth around my cabin. They weren't mine. I had hiking boots with a distinctive tread pattern, and these were different. They circled the entire cabin, lingering under my bedroom window, before heading off in the direction of the creek, toward the old Redmond cabin. I followed the prints, not sure why I was doing something so stupid, but driven by some morbid curiosity. They led straight through the woods, but about halfway to the Redman cabin, they just disappeared. Not like someone had covered them up. They literally stopped in the middle of a patch of pine needles, as if whoever made them had vanished into thin air. That was it for me. I ran back to my cabin, threw my stuff into my bag without even folding anything, and was in my car within 20 minutes. I didn't even lock the cabin door behind me. I just wanted to get the hell out of there. I texted Bill from the road when I got cell service, making up some family emergency. He seemed understanding and even refunded half my money, which I didn't expect. A month passed, and I tried to forget about the whole thing. I told myself the footprints could have been from another hiker, though that doesn't explain why they were circling my cabin at 3 in the morning. I almost convinced myself that I'd imagined the whole thing, or at least exaggerated it in my mind. Then last week, I saw a news article that made my blood run cold. Investigators had discovered a buried metal canister behind the Redman cabin containing dozens of surveillance photographs of the family. The photos documented their daily routines over the course of more than a year. Them eating dinner, the kids getting on the school bus, Carla hanging laundry. The article said they'd finally linked the murders to a maintenance worker who had been employed by several cabin owners in the area. He'd been watching the Redmond family, learning their routines, waiting for the perfect opportunity. The power outage from the storm had given him exactly what he needed: isolation, darkness, and no way for them to call for help. The worker had died in prison 2 years ago while serving time for an unrelated assault charge. They never knew about his connection to the Redmond murders until this new evidence was found. The article mentioned that recent construction in the area had disturbed the canister, and a worker had discovered it and turned it over to police. Recent construction. in an area where the only building for half a mile was my cabin. I keep thinking about those footsteps in the night, about the boot prints that led toward the Redmond cabin before disappearing, about how the nearest neighbor was supposedly half a mile away. I walked through the scene of a brutal crime without knowing it. Someone approached my cabin in the night, and to this day, I have no explanation for any of it. All I know is I'm never going back to those woods again, and I'll never stay in a remote cabin by myself again, no matter how burnt out I feel. Sometimes I still wake up at 3 in the morning, thinking I hear footsteps outside my window. And I wonder if whoever was there that night knew I'd found the Red Man cabin, and what they might have done if I'd stayed. Story 9. I can't sleep anymore. Not since the camping trip. Michael tries to reassure me, says it was probably just some hungry hiker who got desperate. But you don't understand. I lived through it. I know exactly what it was. We'd planned this trip for months. After our wedding last year, work got crazy for both of us, and we barely had time to breathe, let alone reconnect. This was supposed to be our chance to get back to the simple things we loved doing when we first met. Just us, the woods, no cell service, no emails. Peace. We chose this spot in the Cascades that Michael had been to years ago. No designated campsites, completely off-grid. You had to hike about 5 miles from the nearest Forest Service road. That was the point, to be completely alone. God, I wish we'd just gone to a regular campground now. The hike in was gorgeous. Early June, wildflowers everywhere, that amazing smell of pine and earth. My shoulders were killing me from my pack, but I didn't care. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. We found this perfect spot near a little stream, far enough that it wouldn't flood if it rained, but close enough to get water easily. The trees created this natural clearing that was just big enough for our tent and a small cooking area. That first evening was exactly what we needed. We set up camp, filtered some water from the stream, and made pasta on our little camp stove. We drank tea and watched the stars come out, talking about nothing important. I remember feeling so content, so safe. I even mentioned to Michael how nice it was to be somewhere so remote where you didn't have to worry about other people. We'd brought this bright blue bear-proof cooler, not one of those huge Coleman ones, but a specialized camping one with a proper lock and key. It was expensive, but worth it in bear country. I kept the key in a little pouch in my backpack, which I stored in the tent with us. We were careful about food, making sure everything was locked up tight before going to bed. The first night was perfect. The air was cool but not cold, and I slept better than I had in months. The next day, we went for a hike, explored a bit, and came back to camp in the late afternoon to relax and make dinner. That's when I noticed something was off. There was a granola bar wrapper near our cooler. At first, I thought maybe we'd dropped it, but I knew we hadn't had granola bars since breakfast, and we'd packed the wrappers in our trash bag, which was also properly stored. "Michael," I said, pointing to it, "did you get a snack earlier and forget to throw this away?" He looked confused. "No, maybe it blew in from somewhere." But there had been no wind that day, and when I picked it up, it wasn't weathered at all. It looked fresh. We checked the cooler, but it was still locked, exactly as we'd left it. No signs of tampering, no scratches around the lock, nothing. We figured maybe we were mistaken about the wrapper and tried to put it out of our minds. That night, I had trouble falling asleep. Every noise made me jump, an owl hooting, a branch creaking, the stream bubbling. Normal forest sounds that suddenly seemed ominous. I eventually drifted off, but my sleep was restless. The next morning, I woke up before Michael and went to get breakfast started. When I unlocked the cooler, my stomach dropped. Several things were missing: a pack of jerky, some trail mix, and 2 energy bars. The cooler had definitely been locked when I opened it. There were no claw marks, no signs that an animal had gotten into it. I woke Michael up immediately. "Someone's been in our food," I whispered, terrified of being overheard, even though there shouldn't have been anyone for miles. He checked the cooler, himself, confused. Maybe we ate more than we thought yesterday, or packed less than we remembered? But I knew the inventory. I had packed everything myself, meticulously planning each meal. Those items were definitely there the day before. We spent the morning looking for tracks, signs of other campers, anything. We found nothing. No footprints, no trampled vegetation, no campsites. We were alone, or should have been. That's when the fear really set in. Someone had accessed our locked cooler without leaving a trace. They had a key or knew how to pick the lock without damaging it. They had been in our camp while we slept. Michael suggested we pack up and leave, but it was already afternoon. By the time we broke camp and hiked back to the car, it would be dark. I didn't want to be hiking in the dark with someone potentially following us. So we decided to stay one more night and leave first thing in the morning. I kept the key pouch clutched inside my sleeping bag that night. Every time Michael moved or the tent rustled in the slight breeze, I startled awake. Around sunset, Michael had set up his phone on a little tripod across from the cooler, angled so it could capture any movement. He set it to record on motion detection, hiding it behind some branches so it wasn't obvious. Neither of us slept much that night. I kept imagining someone standing outside our tent, watching us, waiting. The nylon walls of the tent suddenly seemed pathetically thin. Every shadow looked like a person. Morning couldn't come soon enough. As soon as there was enough light, we got up. Michael retrieved his phone before we even made coffee. We huddled together in the tent to watch the footage, and what we saw still makes my skin crawl. At 2:40 in the morning, a hooded figure approached our campsite. They moved slowly, deliberately, checking the tent first. I could see them pause and look directly at where we were sleeping. Then they went to the cooler. From their pocket, they took out what looked exactly like our key, the same distinctive shape, the same little blue tag I'd attached to it. They unlocked the cooler smoothly, like they'd done it a dozen times. They took a few items, I couldn't see exactly what, and then carefully relocked it before slipping away into the darkness. The whole thing took less than a minute. I felt sick, physically, violently sick. I barely made it out of the tent before throwing up. Michael looked pale, like he'd seen a ghost. "They have a copy of our key," I whispered, even though watching the video made it obvious. That's when I remembered. 3 weeks before the trip, I'd been so excited about our new gear that I'd shared photos in a group chat with some friends. One of the photos showed the cooler with the key in the lock. The key was a simple luggage-style key, the kind any locksmith could duplicate from a clear photo. But who would do this, and why? None of our friends would pull such a terrifying prank, especially not after hiking 5 miles into the wilderness to do it. We packed up in record time, not even bothering with breakfast. The whole time, I kept looking around, expecting to see that hooded figure watching us from between the trees. The hike back to the car was a blur of paranoia. Every snapping twig made me jump. Every shadow in the forest looked like a person following us. When we finally reached our car, it was untouched. No signs of tampering, nothing. We drove nonstop until we reached a gas station about 2 hours away. Only then did we feel safe enough to stop, use the bathroom, and try to process what had happened. We filed a report with the Forest Service, but they didn't seem particularly concerned. Probably just another camper who needed food, the ranger suggested, even after we explained about the locked cooler and the key. They took our information, but made it clear that with no harm done and nothing of significant value stolen, there wasn't much they could do. It's been 2 weeks now, and I still can't shake the feeling of being watched. I've changed all the locks in our house. I threw away the cooler. I couldn't stand to look at it anymore. Michael installed security cameras around our property, but it's not the theft that keeps me up at night. It's the calculated nature of it all. They didn't take everything. They didn't try to harm us. They just demonstrated that they could get to us whenever they wanted. That's what terrifies me. Someone watched us plan this trip. Someone saw my photos and made a key. Someone followed us 5 miles into the wilderness, not to rob us or hurt us, but to let us know they were there, to invade our space, our sense of security, to remind us that even in the most remote places, we weren't truly alone. I keep thinking about how they looked at our tent first, how they knew exactly where we were sleeping, how easy it would have been for them to do something worse than steal some snacks. I haven't been camping since. I don't know if I ever will again. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, certain there's someone standing outside our bedroom, watching us through the window. And the worst part? I have no idea who they are or why they chose us. The wilderness doesn't scare me anymore. People do. Story 10. I've never been much of an outdoors person, but after my breakup with Sarah and the stress of being passed over for promotion at work, I desperately needed to get away from everything. No phone service, no co-workers, no reminders of my failed relationship, just me and nature. That's how I ended up at Blackwood Creek Campgrounds last week, a spot about 3 hours north of town that I found on some obscure camping forum. The drive there was peaceful enough. I followed the GPS until it lost signal, then relied on the printed directions I'd brought as backup. The main road eventually turned into gravel, then into what was barely more than a dirt path. Perfect. Exactly the isolation I was looking for. I arrived around 4 in the afternoon on Friday. The campsite was gorgeous, better than the pictures online suggested. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by dense pine forest, with a crystal clear lake about 50 yards away. No other campers in sight. The camp host had mentioned they were having a slow season, and the more remote sites rarely got visitors after Labor Day. Setting up was straightforward. I pitched my tent on a flat spot near a fire ring, organized my supplies, and gathered firewood before sunset. The whole time I had this incredible sense of relief washing over me. The air smelled like pine and earth, birds were chirping overhead, and for the first time in months, my shoulders didn't feel tight with anxiety. As dusk fell, I got a small fire going and heated up the chili I'd brought in a small pot. The temperature was dropping, but not uncomfortably so. I sat in my folding chair, eating my dinner and watching the flames dance, feeling more relaxed than I had in ages. That's when I first noticed it, movement at the edge of the firelight. I initially thought it was a raccoon or maybe a fox, but when I shined my flashlight, I saw it was a cat. A gray cat with these strange yellowish-green eyes that caught the light in an almost unnatural way. It wasn't unusual to see feral cats, but something about this one immediately struck me as odd. Most wild animals, especially cats that aren't used to humans, will dart away when spotted. This one didn't. It just stared at me, completely still except for the slow swish of its tail. "Hey there," I called out, not expecting a reaction. The cat blinked slowly, then, and this is what first unsettled me, it walked directly into my camp with this deliberate, almost human-like confidence. It wasn't skittish, wasn't darting around. It walked with its tail high, moving methodically around the perimeter of my sight, stopping to look at my tent, my backpack, my cooler. It was like it was taking inventory. I offered it some of my chili, figuring it might be hungry, but it showed zero interest in the food. Again, weird for a wild animal. It just continued its inspection of my camp before settling down about 15 feet away from me, sitting upright with its tail wrapped around its paws, watching me. "Suit yourself," I muttered, trying to ignore the strange feeling creeping up my spine. For the next hour or so, as I finished my dinner and read my book by the fire, the cat remained in exactly the same position, not grooming itself, not dozing off like cats typically do, just watching me. Every time I looked up, its eyes were fixed on me. Around 10, I decided to turn in. The cat was still there, still watching, as I zipped up my tent. I remember thinking it would probably wander off once I was out of sight. I slept surprisingly well that first night, exhausted from the drive and setup. When I woke around 7 the next morning and unzipped my tent, I nearly jumped out of my skin. The cat was curled up directly outside my tent flap, as if it had been there all night. Its eyes opened as soon as I moved the zipper, and it looked up at me with that same unblinking stare. "Jesus," I gasped, "you scared me." The cat stood, stretched leisurely, and then walked off into the woods without a backward glance. The whole thing left me feeling weirdly violated, like my privacy had been invaded. Still, it was just a cat, right? Probably belonged to campers who'd abandoned it or something equally sad. I spent the day hiking around the lake, fishing a bit, though I didn't catch anything, and trying to clear my head. The whole time I kept thinking I saw movement in my peripheral vision, but whenever I'd turn to look, there was nothing there. By late afternoon, I'd convinced myself I was just being paranoid. When I returned to camp to start dinner, the cat was back. This time, it was sitting on a stump near my fire pit, as if it had been waiting for me. Again, it made that same methodical circuit around my camp, examining everything, showing no interest in the trout I'd bought at a local store before the trip. "You're a weird little dude, you know that?" I said, trying to laugh off my discomfort. As night fell and I got the fire going again, my unease grew. The cat's behavior was just wrong. It never meowed, never purred, never did any of the normal cat things. It would just change positions occasionally, always keeping me in its line of sight. I found myself checking over my shoulder constantly, the relaxation I'd felt the day before completely gone. That second night, I had trouble falling asleep. Every rustle outside the tent had me on edge. I kept imagining the cat circling my tent, watching me through the thin fabric. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted off. What happened next is what convinced me to leave. I woke suddenly in the middle of the night. My phone said it was 3:17 in the morning. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. There was no noise, no movement. Then I noticed that my tent flap was partially open. I always zip it fully closed, especially in unfamiliar woods. Always. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw it. The cat was sitting in the opening, half inside my tent, completely motionless except for the tip of its tail, which moved in a slow, rhythmic pattern. Its eyes seemed to glow faintly in the dark, fixed directly on my face. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I could hear blood rushing in my ears. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only seconds. Then came the most disturbing part. The cat slowly tilted its head to one side in a questioning gesture that seemed far too intelligent, far too human. In that moment, I became absolutely certain of two things. This creature had been watching me sleep all night, every night I'd been there, and whatever I was looking at wasn't really a cat. Not in the normal sense, anyway. I don't know if you've ever felt it, that primal, instinctive knowledge that something is fundamentally wrong. Not dangerous in the way a bear or snake might be, but wrong in a way that defies explanation. That's what I felt looking at this cat. I didn't move, didn't speak. Some deep instinct told me to pretend I was still asleep. I closed my eyes to slits, just enough to see that the cat hadn't moved. It continued watching me, head still tilted, for at least another 20 minutes before it slowly backed out of my tent. I didn't sleep again that night. I lay there, straining to hear any sound of movement outside, clutching my pocket knife even though I had no intention of using it. What would I even do? Stab a cat? The thought was ridiculous, but then this didn't feel like a normal animal encounter. As soon as the first light of dawn appeared, I was up and packing. No coffee, no breakfast, just throwing everything into my backpack as quickly as possible. I kept scanning the trees, expecting to see those eyes watching me, but there was no sign of the cat. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely collapse my tent poles. I kept telling myself I was being stupid, that it was just a stray cat with odd behavior, but I couldn't shake the feeling of wrongness that had settled over me. Just as I was about to leave, as I was doing one final check to make sure I hadn't left anything behind, I saw it. The cat was sitting at the edge of the clearing, partially hidden by a fallen log, watching me with those same unblinking eyes. I didn't acknowledge it. I just grabbed my gear and started walking, fast, toward the trail that led back to my car. The entire half-mile hike, I felt like something was following me, just out of sight in the underbrush. The usual morning forest sounds, birds, insects, the rustle of small animals, were absent, leaving an unnatural silence that only amplified my fear. When I reached my car, I threw my backpack in the trunk and practically jumped into the driver's seat, locking the doors immediately. My hands were shaking so badly it took 3 tries to get the key in the ignition. As the engine roared to life, I glanced in my rearview mirror. There it was, sitting in the middle of the dirt road behind my car, tail wrapped neatly around its paws, watching, waiting. For what? I have no idea. I reversed, not caring if I hit it. It moved, of course, then spun the car around and floored it down the rough track, not slowing until I hit paved road 20 minutes later. I've spent the past week trying to rationalize what happened. Maybe it was just an unusually intelligent feral cat. Maybe I was projecting my stress onto a normal animal encounter. Maybe lack of sleep was making me paranoid. But then I remembered something that makes me certain it wasn't just in my head. When I got home and was unpacking, I found 3 long gray hairs stuck to the inside of my tent, right where my pillow had been. I have dark brown hair. Those weren't mine. The camp host called yesterday to say I'd left my camping hatchet behind. I told him to keep it. I'm never going back there. And the weirdest part? Last night, I'm almost certain I saw a gray shape move past my apartment window. I live on the 4th floor. I still can't explain what that cat was or what it wanted. All I know is, sometimes things watch us from the woods, and sometimes they follow us home. Story 11. I've been debating whether to share this for almost a year now. I still get goosebumps thinking about it, and I'm not the type who scares easily. I've been camping and hiking since I was a kid, spent countless nights in the wilderness. But what happened last summer on Black Ridge Mountain has made me rethink every solo trip I've planned since. My buddy Greg and I had been planning this trip for months. We're both experienced outdoorsmen, and we wanted to push ourselves a bit by going somewhere really remote. Black Ridge isn't on many hiking maps. It's about 3 hours from the nearest town, with no established campgrounds or even proper trails near the summit. Just pure, untouched wilderness. That was the appeal. We parked at an old logging road access point on Friday afternoon last July and hiked about 7 miles in before setting up camp. It was tough going with our full packs, lots of bushwhacking through dense forest and climbing over fallen trees. The kind of hike where you don't see another soul the entire day. We found this perfect little clearing near a small stream around 4 in the afternoon. The spot was incredible. A natural opening in the forest with soft, level ground for our tents and easy access to water. We were completely surrounded by towering pines and had this amazing view of the valley below through a break in the trees. You could see for miles nothing but wilderness in every direction. The first strange thing I noticed was the silence. I've been in remote places before, but there's usually some ambient noise. Birds, insects, wind in the trees. Here, it was just dead quiet. Greg noticed it too, but we brushed it off, thinking maybe it was just the time of day or something about the mountain's acoustics. We got our camp set up, collected firewood, and filtered some water from the stream. As the sun started to set, we got a decent fire going and cooked up some freeze-dried meals. Just your typical camping evening, sharing stories and passing a flask of whiskey back and forth. The night was clear, with more stars than you could imagine. No light pollution for probably 100 miles. It must have been around 10:30 at night when we first heard it. At first, I thought I was imagining things. It started so faintly that I wasn't even sure if it was real. This singing voice carried on the wind. I remember freezing mid-sentence and looking at Greg to see if he heard it too. The expression on his face told me everything I needed to know. "You hear that?" he whispered, even though there was nobody else around for miles. I nodded, not wanting to speak and potentially miss the sound. We both sat completely still, listening. The singing grew slightly louder, not because it was getting closer, but like whoever was singing had raised their voice a bit. It was definitely a woman's voice, high and clear, with this haunting quality I can't really describe. The melody was unlike anything I've ever heard before, not modern at all, more like something you'd imagine hearing in some ancient European cathedral. The language wasn't English, Spanish, or anything I could recognize. It had this old, flowing quality to it, with sounds I'm not even sure how to reproduce. "What the fuck?" Greg whispered. "There shouldn't be anyone else up here." He was right. We were miles from any trail, and this wasn't exactly a popular mountain for hikers. The nearest designated camping area was at least 10 miles away. Plus, who would be singing alone in pitch darkness in the middle of nowhere? We listened for maybe 5 minutes as the singing continued, sometimes fading almost to nothing, then becoming clearer again, like the wind was carrying it in waves. I tried to pinpoint the direction, but it seemed to shift. Sometimes it sounded like it was coming from the ridge above us, sometimes from the valley below. "Should we check it out?" Greg asked, but I could tell from his tone he didn't actually want to. "Hell no," I replied. "We don't know what's out there, and I'm not stumbling around these woods in the dark." The singing continued for about 20 minutes before gradually fading away completely. We sat in silence for a long time afterward, straining to hear if it would return. It didn't. but neither of us felt particularly sleepy anymore. Maybe it was just carrying from really far away, Greg suggested, not sounding convinced. Sound does weird things in mountains. I nodded, wanting to believe that explanation, but something about the quality of the voice felt wrong. It was too clear, too present to be coming from miles away. We ended up staying by the fire much later than planned, neither of us eager to crawl into our separate tents. When we finally did turn in around 1 in the morning, I lay awake for hours, listening for any sound outside the thin nylon walls of my tent. The rest of the night passed without incident, and in the morning light, the whole thing seemed less creepy. We joked about it over breakfast, coming up with increasingly ridiculous explanations. Maybe it was a ghost, or a forest spirit, or just some hippie woman who liked to wander the mountains singing to herself at night. We spent the day exploring the area, hiking up to a small summit about 2 miles from our camp. The views were incredible, and the weirdness of the previous night faded as we focused on the beauty around us. By the time we returned to camp that evening, I'd almost convinced myself we'd imagined the whole thing, or exaggerated it in our minds. Almost. We built up the fire again as darkness fell, and I noticed Greg kept glancing into the surrounding forest. I was doing the same thing. We were both waiting, listening for that voice to return. But nothing happened that second night. We stayed up late again, partly from being keyed up waiting for something to happen. But the forest remained silent. Eventually we went to bed, and the next morning we packed up and headed back down the mountain. The hike out was uneventful, and by the time we reached the car, the whole experience had taken on a dreamlike quality in my mind. A week later, I posted some photos from the trip on Facebook. Just typical camping shots, our tents, the fire, the view from the summit, nothing special. 2 days after that, I got a call from Mike, a friend I'd known since college. He and I had gone on a few camping trips together years back, but he'd moved to another state, and we'd mostly kept in touch through social media. "Dude," he said as soon as I answered, his voice tense, "I saw your camping photos. Was that on Black Ridge?" "Yeah," I replied, surprised. "How'd you know?" "I recognized that clearing with the stream. I camped there 3 years ago with my dog Rex." Something in his voice made my skin crawl. "Did something happen when you were there?" There was a long pause before Mike spoke again. "I never told anyone about this because I thought people would think I was crazy. But seeing your pictures from the exact same spot, I need to know if anything weird happened while you were there." I hesitated before telling him about the singing we'd heard. As I described it, I heard Mike's breathing change on the other end of the line. "It wasn't singing when I was there," he said quietly. "It was crying, a woman crying." He told me he'd been there alone, just him and his German shepherd, Rex. They'd found the clearing the same way we had, thought it was perfect for a campsite. He'd been there for 2 nights already and was planning to stay 1 more. On the 3rd night, around midnight, he heard what sounded like a woman crying somewhere on the road they'd hiked in on. "At first I thought someone was hurt," Mike said. "I grabbed my flashlight and headlamp, put Rex on his leash, and went to check it out." He said the crying got louder as they approached, and Rex started acting strangely, pulling against the leash, whining, the fur on his back standing up. They got within about 100 yards of where he thought the sound was coming from, and Mike called out, asking if anyone needed help. The second I called out, the crying just stopped. Complete silence. I stood there for a few minutes, calling out, shining my light around, but there was nothing. Finally, I figured either I'd imagined it or whoever it was didn't want to be found, so we headed back to camp. When they returned, Rex collapsed by the fire and started convulsing, foam coming from his mouth. Mike panicked, thinking his dog had been poisoned somehow. He quickly broke down his camp, packed everything up, and carried Rex, who was still seizing, back down the trail toward his car. He was about 70 pounds, so it wasn't easy, Mike continued. About halfway down the mountain, he went completely limp. I thought he was dead. I was crying, still carrying him, determined to at least get his body back to the car. Then came the part that made the hair on my arms stand up. The moment we reached the base of the mountain, right where the forest opens up to that old logging clearing where you park, Rex suddenly perked up. Just like that, he was completely fine. Jumped out of my arms, wagging his tail, looking at me like, "What's the problem?" No sign he'd ever been sick. The vet couldn't find anything wrong with him the next day. We were both quiet for a long moment. "The thing is," Mike finally said, "I've never been able to explain what happened. But I've never gone back to Black Ridge since then. And Rex, who used to love hiking and was the bravest dog I've ever known, refuses to even get in the car if I pack my camping gear now." After talking to Mike, I did some research on Black Ridge Mountain. There's not much documented history, no famous incidents or ghost stories. It's just a forgotten peak in a range of more popular mountains. But I did find one small reference in an old local history book mentioning that the indigenous people of the region considered it a place to be avoided, especially at night. No explanation was given. I haven't been back, and neither has Greg. We've gone camping since then, but always in established areas, always with other people nearby. Sometimes when I'm lying in my tent at night, I think I can hear that singing again, just at the edge of my hearing. That strange ancient melody in a language no one speaks anymore. I still don't know what was on that mountain, but whatever it was, it didn't want us there. Story 12. I still feel sick to my stomach when I think about what happened to us in Plumas National Forest last summer. It's been 8 months, and I haven't gone hiking since. Not even on the well-marked trails near my apartment. The 4 of us had been planning this camping trip for months. Alex and I had been friends since college. Sarah was Alex's girlfriend of 3 years. And Mark was my roommate who'd been wanting to go camping with us for ages. We weren't expert hikers by any means, but we'd done enough weekend trips to feel comfortable with the basics. We arrived at Plumas Friday afternoon around 4. The drive up from Sacramento took longer than expected because of road construction, so we were all eager to set up camp before dark. The main campground was pretty busy, summer weekend and all, but we found a decent spot about a 10-minute walk from the restrooms. Not ideal, but we weren't being picky at that point. We spent Friday night drinking beers around the campfire, talking about what trails we wanted to hit the next day. Sarah had done all this research about the best hiking spots in the area. She'd even printed out maps and trail information. That's just how she is, always prepared. We settled on a moderate 5-mile loop trail that was supposed to have great views of the valley. Saturday morning started perfectly. We had breakfast, packed our day packs with water, energy bars, first aid supplies, the usual stuff. It was around 9:30 when we headed to the trailhead. The weather couldn't have been better. Clear skies, maybe 75 degrees, slight breeze. We were about to start on our planned trail when this guy approached us in the parking lot. He looked to be in his 30s, had this scruffy beard, wearing a faded green cap and hiking clothes that had definitely seen better days. Nothing too unusual for someone who spends a lot of time outdoors. He was friendly, asked if we were heading to Eagle Falls Trail. When we said yes, he kind of chuckled and said, "That trail's going to be packed today. All the tourists hit that one." He introduced himself as Pete and mentioned he was a local who hiked the area almost every weekend. Then he pulled out a worn topographic map and showed us this unmarked trail that supposedly branched off about a mile into our planned route. "This trail isn't on any of the official maps," he said. "Local secret. Leads to these amazing waterfalls that hardly anyone visits. Way better than the crowded spots." I remember Sarah shifting uncomfortably beside me. She's always been the cautious one in our group. But Alex and Mark were immediately interested, asking questions about how difficult the trail was, how long it would take. Pete was so convincing, describing these crystal-clear pools at the base of the falls where you could swim without another soul in sight. He even showed us some photos on his phone. They looked incredible. "It's about 2 hours each way," he said. "The path gets a bit rough in places, but nothing you guys can't handle." We stepped away to discuss it among ourselves. Sarah was hesitant. "I don't know, guys. None of my research mentioned this trail, and we don't know this person at all." But Mark was already sold on the idea. "Come on, this is exactly the kind of adventure we came here for. Getting off the beaten path, seeing something most tourists don't get to see." Alex agreed with Mark, and I'll admit, I was leaning that way too. The promise of having a beautiful spot all to ourselves was pretty tempting. After a few minutes of back and forth, Sarah reluctantly agreed, but I could tell she wasn't totally comfortable with the change of plans. Pete gave us detailed directions, pointing out landmarks to watch for after we left the main trail. He said he was heading in a different direction today to meet some friends, but might catch up with us later at the falls if they finished their hike early. We thanked him and set off. The first mile was exactly as expected, well-maintained trail, other hikers passing by, clear markers. Then we came to the fork Pete had described. The main trail continued straight ahead with a clear sign, while a much narrower path branched off to the left, partially hidden by some bushes. No signs, no markings. I remember standing there for a moment, all of us looking at each other. Sarah checked her printed maps one more time, confirming this trail wasn't documented. "We can still stick to the original plan," she said. "That trail looks like it hardly gets used." But curiosity got the better of us. We took the left fork and started down the unmarked path. At first it wasn't bad. The trail was narrow but clear enough to follow. After about 20 minutes, though, it started getting steeper and less defined. We had to push through some overgrown sections, and the terrain became rockier. That's when we noticed the first cairn, a stack of rocks that hikers sometimes build as trail markers. It looked freshly made, the stones still clean with no moss or dirt buildup. Normally, cairns are reassuring, but something about this one felt off. None of us said anything at the time, but I remember exchanging glances with Sarah. We continued on, following the increasingly difficult path. The forest was getting denser, the canopy above blocking out more of the sunlight. What had started as an exciting detour was beginning to feel uncomfortable. About an hour in, we came across another cairn, and then another. They were appearing more frequently now, guiding us deeper into the forest. That's when Sarah stopped walking. "Guys, does anyone else think it's weird that these cairns look so new, and they're perfectly placed right when the trail gets confusing?" Alex tried to brush it off. "Maybe Pete comes through here regularly and maintains them." "Or other hikers who know about this spot," Mark added. But I was starting to feel uneasy too. It is strange that we haven't seen anybody else on this trail. Pete made it sound like it was a local secret, but still. We decided to push on a little further. The promise of those waterfalls kept us going, even as the trail grew more challenging. After another 30 minutes, we reached a point where the path seemed to vanish entirely, leading into a dense thicket. That's when I spotted another cairn off to our right, indicating we should go that way. But this time, something clicked in my brain. "Wait," I said, looking back the way we came. "I don't remember seeing that cairn when we walked by here." We all turned around, and sure enough, there was another stack of rocks about 15 feet behind us on the trail. A cairn that definitely hadn't been there when we passed that spot minutes earlier. Sarah's face went pale. Someone's making these as we go. Someone's following us. As if to confirm her words, we heard the snap of branches somewhere off to our left. Then another, someone moving through the underbrush. Mark whispered, "Maybe it's just animals." But we all knew better. The sounds were too deliberate, too rhythmic for an animal. "We need to go back," Sarah said firmly. "Now." No one argued. We turned around and started moving quickly back along the trail. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I kept looking over my shoulder, but the thick forest made it impossible to see very far. We'd been walking for maybe 10 minutes when a figure stepped out onto the path about 30 yards ahead of us. It was Pete, the hiker from the parking lot, but his friendly demeanor was gone. His face was hard, his posture tense. "Leaving so soon?" he called out. "But you haven't seen the falls yet." My heart started hammering in my chest. I felt Alex grab my arm, squeezing tight. "We decided to head back," I called, trying to keep my voice steady. "Thanks anyway." Pete took a step toward us. "That's disappointing. My friends were looking forward to meeting you." As he said this, 2 more men emerged from the trees on either side of the trail behind him. They were both holding machetes. My blood went cold. One of the men, taller with a shaved head, smiled at us. "Nice gear you got there. Those packs look expensive." In that moment, everything became crystal clear. The secluded trail, the friendly advice, the cairns leading us deeper into isolation. It had all been a trap. Mark, who was at the front of our group, whispered back to us, "When I say go, drop your packs and run. Not back the way we came, head right downhill. The main trail should be in that direction." Pete must have sensed something was up because he started moving toward us more quickly. "Why don't you all just set down those backpacks nice and slow?" "Go!" Mark shouted. We dropped our packs and bolted to the right, crashing through the underbrush. I heard shouts behind us, feet pounding on the dirt. Sarah was right beside me, Alex and Mark just ahead. The forest floor was treacherous. Roots, rocks, fallen branches. I nearly fell twice. I could hear them pursuing us, getting closer. Something whooshed past my ear, a rock or stick they'd thrown. I felt fingers brush the back of my shirt, trying to grab me. Pure adrenaline surged through my body. I pushed harder, my lungs burning. We were running downhill now, the slope getting steeper. Mark stumbled, went down, but Alex grabbed his arm and hauled him back up without stopping. I don't know how long we ran, maybe 5 minutes, maybe 15. Time lost all meaning, but eventually the sounds of pursuit faded, and we burst out onto a wider, well-maintained path. The main trail. We didn't stop running until we reached the parking lot. Our car sat there, along with maybe 2 others and an old blue pickup truck with mud covering where the license plate should have been. We piled into our car, hands shaking so badly that Alex dropped the keys twice before managing to start the engine. We sped out of there, not stopping until we reached the ranger station about 20 minutes away. The ranger called the sheriff, who took our statements. They seemed concerned but not surprised. They said they'd had reports of similar incidents in the area over the past year, hikers being led astray, sometimes robbed. They promised to send deputies to investigate. We drove straight back to Sacramento that day, leaving behind our tent and most of our gear. None of us wanted to stay another minute in those woods. The sheriff's office called once about a week later, saying they'd found no sign of the men we described, though they did locate what was left of our packs, emptied of anything valuable. After that, we never heard anything more. I called a few times for updates but eventually gave up. I still think about what might have happened if we hadn't gotten away. Those machetes weren't just for show. Sometimes I wake up feeling phantom fingers grabbing at my shirt, and I can't shake the image of Pete's face changing from friendly guide to something predatory. So if you're hiking, especially in remote areas, stick to the marked trails. Don't trust strangers offering shortcuts to hidden beauty spots. And if you see freshly made cairns appearing on a trail where they shouldn't be, turn around immediately. Someone might be leading you into a trap. Story 13. I can't believe I'm finally writing this down. It's been just over 3 weeks since I got back, and I've barely slept more than a few hours at a time. Every little noise outside my apartment has me jumping out of my skin. I need to share this with people who might understand or have experienced something similar. I've been an avid solo camper for years. There's nothing like the peace you get when you're completely disconnected from the world. No phones, no people, just you and nature. I'd been planning this particular trip for about 6 months, saving up vacation days and researching the perfect spot. I found what seemed like the ideal location, an unmarked clearing deep in redacted national forest, at least 5 hours from the nearest town and completely off the grid. No cell service, no designated campsites, nothing, just pure wilderness. I'm experienced enough to know what I'm doing out there. I've completed wilderness survival courses, I know how to pack efficiently, and I always bring emergency supplies. This was supposed to be a week-long retreat, 7 days completely to myself to reset and recharge. I'd mapped everything out meticulously, packed carefully, and was genuinely excited as I parked my car at the trailhead that Thursday morning. The hike-in was beautiful. Early May, perfect weather, wildflowers starting to bloom. I reached my clearing by mid-afternoon and set up camp. It was exactly what I'd hoped for, a pristine, untouched spot surrounded by dense forest, with a small stream about 50 yards away. I spent that first day setting up my tent, gathering firewood, and just enjoying the silence. That night was perfect, clear sky, full of stars, the kind of view you never get in the city. I fell asleep to the sound of the breeze through the trees and slept better than I had in months. The next day started normally. I had breakfast, secured my food in a bear canister, standard procedure, and decided to explore the area a bit more. There was a faint game trail leading deeper into the woods, so I followed it, marking my path as I went. I'd gone maybe a mile when I noticed something odd about the trail. The foliage was disturbed in a way that didn't look natural. Not just animals passing through, but almost like something had been dragged across the ground. There were some pretty large tracks too, canine-looking, but bigger than any coyote prints I'd seen before. At the time, I didn't think much of it. The forest has all kinds of wildlife, and I assumed it was just a large wolf or maybe even a bear that had passed through. I took a few photos of the tracks with my camera. I have a digital camera I bring to document my trips, and continued exploring before heading back to camp in the late afternoon. That second night is when things started to feel wrong. I was in my tent, reading by headlamp around 10 when I heard movement outside. Not small animal movement, heavy, deliberate movement. Something was circling my campsite. I could hear twigs snapping under significant weight. Whatever it was stopped right outside my tent. I could hear it breathing. Deep, heavy breaths that didn't sound like any animal I was familiar with. My tent wall moved slightly, like something was pressing against it, testing it. I didn't move. I barely breathed. After what felt like forever, but was probably only a minute or two, the thing moved away. I heard it crashing through the underbrush, getting fainter until it disappeared completely. I'd like to say I was brave enough to go outside and check, but I wasn't. I stayed in my tent, knife in hand, until morning came. When I finally emerged at first light, what I found disturbed me more than the night visitor itself. There were tracks all around my tent, 3 distinct sets of large, dog-like prints. They had methodically circled my entire campsite multiple times. These weren't the random wanderings of a curious animal. This looked coordinated, purposeful. The tracks were similar to what I'd seen on the game trail the day before, but seeing them surrounding my tent made my stomach drop. I spent most of that morning reinforcing my campsite. I built up my fire ring, gathered a massive pile of firewood, and made sure I had everything I might need within arm's reach of my tent. Part of me was already thinking about leaving, but I told myself I was overreacting. Wolves are naturally curious, but rarely dangerous to humans. I convinced myself it was nothing to worry about. Around midday, I heard a bark in the distance. Just one. Sharp, loud, and somehow wrong-sounding. Not quite like a wolf or coyote, but similar enough that I told myself that's what it had to be. The sound echoed through the trees, and I found myself unconsciously moving closer to my knife. That night, I kept the fire burning high. I didn't want to sleep, but eventually exhaustion took over around 1 in the morning. I woke suddenly at what must have been around 3, that stillest, darkest part of the night. They were back. I could hear them moving around my camp, not just one this time, but 3 distinct patterns of movement. One of them pressed against my tent again, right by my head. Not aggressively, just there, present, watching. I could smell it, a musky, wild odor mixed with something metallic that I realized later was probably blood. I lay completely still, my heart pounding so hard I was sure the creature could hear it. After a few moments, they all moved away together. Their movements synchronized in a way that sent chills up my spine. I made the decision right then that I wasn't staying the full week. As soon as it was light enough to see, I began packing up my camp. I've never broken down a campsite so quickly in my life. By 7 in the morning, I was on the trail heading back toward my car, still about 6 hours away, at a good pace. That's when I started noticing more disturbing signs along the trail, more drag marks, patches of dried blood on leaves, small animal bones scattered in places, picked clean. I picked up my pace, fighting the urge to run blindly through the forest. About 2 hours into my hike out, I got the feeling I was being followed. You know that prickly sensation on the back of your neck? It was that, but amplified by 1,000. Occasional movement caught in my peripheral vision, the snap of twigs behind me, glimpses of shapes moving between trees, always just out of clear view. I stopped and turned suddenly, hoping to catch whatever was following me off guard. And that's when I saw one of them clearly for the first time. It was standing about 30 yards away, partially hidden behind a large pine tree. It was wrong. That's the only word I can think of to describe it. It looked vaguely like a wolf or large dog, but the proportions were all off. It stood taller than any canine I'd ever seen, with unnaturally long limbs. Its fur was patchy and dark, almost black in places. But it was its face that haunts me most, too intelligent, too focused. It was watching me with an intensity that felt calculated. When it realized I'd spotted it, it didn't run away like a normal wild animal would. It just slowly backed up, maintaining eye contact until it disappeared into the denser forest. I stood frozen for several seconds before my survival instinct kicked in and I continued walking, faster now. The smell became more noticeable as I continued, that same musky, wet fur scent mixed with blood and something sour I couldn't identify. Sometimes it would be overwhelmingly strong, then disappear completely, as if they were intentionally letting me know they were there. About halfway back to my car, I came across something that nearly made me vomit. A deer carcass, fresh, couldn't have been more than a few hours old, but it wasn't killed like how mountain lions or other predators kill. This deer had been savagely torn open, its limbs broken and twisted at impossible angles, entrails partially pulled out but not eaten. This wasn't a predator killing for food. This was something killing for sport? Pleasure? I don't know. I practically jogged the rest of the way back to my car, stopping only when absolutely necessary to catch my breath. The sun was getting low by the time I finally reached the trailhead where my car was parked. As I fumbled with my keys, I glanced toward the tree line one last time. They were there, two of them, standing just inside the forest edge, watching me. Not approaching, not threatening, just observing. Like they were studying my behavior, learning. I got in my car, hands shaking so badly I could barely start the engine, and drove away as fast as I safely could on the rough forest road. It took me nearly 2 hours to reach an area with cell service, and by then it was fully dark. I pulled over at the first gas station I found and sat in my car for almost an hour, trying to process what had happened. Here's what terrifies me the most. They weren't hunting me for food. If they had been, I don't think I would have made it out. They were following me, surrounding my camp, pressing against my tent, but never attacking. It was like they were playing with me, testing boundaries, learning what I would do. Like they were intelligent enough to be curious about human behavior. And I can't shake the feeling that next time, if there is a next time, they might not let someone leave. I've tried researching what I encountered. Nothing fits exactly. They weren't normal wolves or coyotes. They were too large, too coordinated, too deliberate in their actions. I've thought about reporting it to forest rangers, but what would I say? That I was stalked by mysterious canine creatures that seemed to be playing with me rather than hunting me. They'd think I was crazy. So I'm sharing this here, hoping someone might have experienced something similar, or might have some explanation I haven't thought of. I used to love the solitude of solo camping, but now I don't think I'll ever go into the woods alone again. Some nights, I still wake up thinking I can smell that musky, bloody scent right outside my bedroom window. Story 14. I still can't explain what happened at Willow Lake last summer. My family has been going to the same cabin for years, 13 years to be exact. It was our special place, surrounded by pine trees, and the kind of quiet you can only find when you're miles from civilization. I loved it there. We all did, until last July. My name's Emily. I'm 22. My brother Thomas is 19, and we'd been going to Willow Lake with our parents, Richard and Karen, since we were kids. The cabin wasn't anything fancy. just a two-bedroom wooden structure with a small kitchen, bathroom, and a living room with a fireplace. But it was ours, or at least it felt like it for those 2 weeks every summer. The lake itself is pretty secluded. You have to drive about 45 minutes down a dirt road after turning off the main highway, and there are only 6 other cabins scattered around the shoreline, each hidden by trees and at least a quarter-mile apart. Most years, we hardly saw another soul. We arrived on a Sunday afternoon. The weather was perfect, warm, but not too hot, with just enough breeze to keep the mosquitoes away. Dad unloaded the car while Mom started unpacking the food. Thomas and I carried our bags to the bedroom we always shared. It felt like coming home. The first few days were normal. We swam, fished, hiked, played cards in the evening. Dad grilled every night, and Mom made her famous potato salad. It was the same routine we'd had for years, comfortable and familiar. Then came Thursday morning. Thomas and I decided to get up early and take the inner tubes out on the lake. The sun wasn't fully up yet, and a light mist hung over the water, making everything look dreamlike. The lake was completely still, like glass. We didn't talk much as we floated, just enjoying the peace. We drifted maybe 100 yards from shore when Thomas nudged my tube with his foot. "Look over there," he whispered, pointing toward the shoreline opposite our cabin. At first I couldn't see anything through the mist. Then I noticed movement, something white moving between the trees at the water's edge. "Is that a dog?" I asked, squinting. It was pale, bone white, and about the size of a large dog, but something wasn't right about the way it moved. As we watched, it stepped out of the tree line and onto the rocky shore. That's when I realized it definitely wasn't a dog. It was standing upright on 2 legs, but hunched over, its body too thin, arms too long. Even from that distance, I could tell it wasn't natural. "What the hell is that?" Thomas whispered, his voice tight. The creature's head snapped in our direction. I don't know if it heard us or just sensed our presence, but suddenly it was staring right at us. I couldn't make out facial features through the mist, just deep, dark hollows where eyes should be. Then it moved, not like a person or an animal. It was jerky, unnatural. 1 second it was hunched over, the next it was fully upright, taller than I'd expected, maybe 6 feet. It stood completely still for what felt like forever, but was probably only seconds. I couldn't breathe. My whole body went cold, despite the warm morning air. Then, in a blur of white, it bolted back into the trees and disappeared. "Holy shit," Thomas gasped. "Did you see that?" My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold onto my inner tube. "Let's go back," I said. We paddled back to our dock as fast as we could. By the time we reached it, I'd almost convinced myself we'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe it was just a deer or someone's dog that looked strange in the mist. But Thomas was pale, and I knew he'd seen the same thing I had. We didn't tell our parents. What would we say? That we saw some kind of monster? They'd think we were making it up or had seen a bear standing on its hind legs. But I knew it wasn't a bear. Bears don't move like that. Nothing happened for the next 2 days. We stuck close to the cabin, though, not venturing too far into the woods or staying out on the lake for long. I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the tree line, jumping at every snapped twig or rustling leaf. On Saturday night, Dad suggested we camp out by the lake. We'd done it before, set up the big tent about 20 yards from the water's edge and spent the night roasting marshmallows, telling stories, and falling asleep to the sound of lapping waves. I didn't want to, neither did Thomas, but we couldn't explain why without sounding crazy, so we went along with it. We set up the tent, built a fire, and tried to act normal. As darkness fell, I kept staring into the woods. Sure, I'd see those hollow eyes staring back at me. But nothing happened. The night was quiet except for the chirping of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. By midnight, Mom and Dad had fallen asleep in the tent. Thomas and I stayed by the dying fire, neither of us saying what we were both thinking, that we were afraid to close our eyes. "Do you think it's still out there?" Thomas finally whispered. I was about to answer when we heard it, a soft cracking of twigs from the edge of the woods behind us. We both froze. Then came a sound I'll never forget, a low, wet breathing, like someone with fluid in their lungs. It wasn't loud, but in the quiet night, it might as well have been a scream. Thomas grabbed my arm so hard it hurt. Slowly, we turned around. It was standing at the edge of the clearing, partially hidden by a pine tree. In the dim light from the embers, its skin looked even more unnatural. Not just white, but almost translucent, like you could see through it. Its body was wrong, too thin, joints bent at impossible angles. But it was the face that made my heart stop. There was hardly anything there, just those deep black eye sockets and a small, lipless mouth. It took a step forward into the clearing. Its movement was jerky, like a video with frames missing. "Dad," Thomas called, his voice cracking. "Dad, wake up!" The thing tilted its head like it was curious. Another step forward. Dad stumbled out of the tent, half asleep and confused. "What? What's wrong?" "There," I pointed, my hand shaking so badly I could barely hold it up. "By the trees." Dad squinted into the darkness. The creature had gone still again, watching us. "What the hell is that?" Dad muttered. He reached for the flashlight we'd left by the fire. As soon as the beam hit it, the creature made a sound, a high-pitched keening that made my skin crawl, and retreated a few steps back into the shadows. Dad grabbed an empty beer bottle from beside the fire pit. "Get in the tent," he ordered us. "Now." We scrambled toward the tent as Dad hurled the bottle. It shattered against a tree near the creature. That's when everything went to hell. The creature moved, not running away like we hoped, but charging toward us with a speed that didn't seem possible. In a blur, it was at the tent. Mom screamed from inside. Thomas and I froze halfway between the fire and the tent. Dad lunged for the cooler, grabbing another bottle. But before he could throw it, something flew through the air, a shard of glass from the bottle he'd thrown. It sliced across my arm, cutting deep. Blood immediately soaked my sleeve. I screamed, clutching my arm. The creature made that horrible keening sound again, but it wasn't scared or angry. It sounded satisfied. The next few minutes were chaos. Dad dragged us all into the tent, zipping it shut as if that flimsy fabric could protect us. Mom wrapped my arm in a t-shirt to stop the bleeding. We could hear the creature circling the tent, its footsteps unnaturally quick. "What is it? What does it want?" Mom kept asking, but none of us had answers. We stayed huddled in that tent for hours. The creature circled us all night, sometimes coming so close we could hear that wet, rasping breath right outside the thin walls. Sometimes it would stop, and we'd hear a soft scratching against the fabric, like it was testing for a way in. Around 3 in the morning, the circling got faster. It was running around the tent at an impossible speed, the sound of its footsteps blending into a continuous noise. The air inside the tent got colder and colder until we could see our breath. None of us spoke. We just held each other, waiting for it to break through, to tear the tent open and take us. But it didn't. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, the circling stopped. There was one final long scraping sound along the side of the tent, and then silence. We waited nearly an hour before Dad finally worked up the courage to unzip the tent and peek outside. There was nothing there, just our campsite, the dead fire, and the forest around us. But on the side of the tent, something had carved a symbol. 3 vertical lines crossed by 1 horizontal line. It wasn't deep, just enough to be visible. We packed up in record time. No one suggested staying the remainder of our vacation. My arm needed stitches anyway, 14 of them to close the wound. The doctor at the urgent care center asked how it happened. Dad said I fell on broken glass. What else could we say? We've never gone back to Willow Lake, never even talked about going back. Sometimes I catch Mom or Dad looking at real estate listings for other vacation spots, but nothing has ever felt right. I still have the scar on my arm, a perfectly straight line about 4 inches long. And sometimes when I wake up in the middle of the night, I swear I can hear that wet breathing outside my window and the soft scratch of something testing the glass, looking for a way in. Whatever was at Willow Lake is still there, I'm sure of it, waiting. And I think it believed we were trespassing on its territory, that we'd been trespassing for 13 summers. It just finally decided to let us know. Story 15. I still don't know how to process what happened. It's been 6 years, and I'm still trying to make sense of it all. I guess I should start from the beginning. I met Nova at a house party in 2015. He was this lanky guy with dark curly hair and these piercing green eyes that seemed to look right through you. We clicked instantly. Despite my Catholic upbringing and general skepticism about all things, spiritual, Nova, and his universe speaks to me outlook somehow made perfect sense. Within weeks, he became like the brother I never had. Nova technically lived in Queens with his mom, but he spent most of his time at my place in Jersey. My apartment became his second home. He'd crash on my couch for days at a time, and honestly, I loved having him around. Nova taught me how to dance, like really dance, not that awkward shuffling I used to do. He noticed how I tensed up whenever someone raised their voice, childhood stuff I don't want to get into, and he'd make it his mission to help me work through it. Your body remembers everything, he'd say. We just got to teach it new patterns. That was Nova, always trying to heal people, always believing in the interconnectedness of everything. I'd roll my eyes, but deep down, I envied his certainty. November 2016 is when things got weird. We were hanging out on a Friday night, had taken some LSD. Not something I did often, but Nova was experienced, and I trusted him. We were just lying on my living room floor, watching the ceiling fans spin and talking about life's big questions. The conversation turned to death. "What would you do if I died?" Nova asked. So casually you'd think he was asking about weekend plans. "I'd probably haunt your ass," I joked, trying to lighten the suddenly heavy mood. He laughed, then got serious. "If I die before you, I'll come back as your cat." "My cat? Why a cat?" "Because you love cats, but you're allergic. In the next life, you won't be. I'll be an orange one like Garfield, the one you always wanted." I remember laughing, but Nova wasn't joking. He held out his hand. "Promise," he said. So I shook on it, because why not humor him? "But you're not allowed to die anytime soon," I added. "I'd be lost without you." "We never really leave each other," he said. "Energy just changes form." By January 2017, things got tense between us. I'd been laid off from my job, and Nova had loaned me $800 to cover rent. I kept promising to pay him back, but finding work was harder than I expected. Each time he asked about the money, I'd get defensive. Looking back, I was a terrible friend. He needed that money for his photography equipment, and I kept making excuses. February came, and we weren't speaking. My birthday was on the 3rd, and for the first time in 2 years, I celebrated without Nova. He texted me that morning, "Happy birthday. Can we talk about the money soon? I need it by next week." I read it and didn't respond. I was hungover, annoyed that all he cared about was the money, and figured I'd deal with it later. That was February 3rd, 2017. February 4th, I woke up to 17 missed calls from mutual friends. Nova was dead. He'd been at a party in Brooklyn. Our friend Alyssa had gotten too drunk to drive home, and Nova, being Nova, volunteered to find her a ride. The guy who agreed to take her home was showing off, driving too fast on the BQE. He lost control. The car flipped 3 times before hitting the barrier. Nova wasn't wearing a seatbelt in the back seat. He died instantly. Here's the part that still haunts me. I was supposed to pick Alyssa up that night. We had planned it earlier in the week, before Nova and I stopped talking. If I hadn't been sulking about the money, if I had just responded to his text, if I had picked up Alyssa like I promised, Nova would still be alive. The guilt nearly destroyed me. I couldn't eat or sleep. I kept rereading our text conversations, looking at photos, replaying our last real conversation over and over in my head. I withdrew from everyone and everything. Some days I couldn't even get out of bed, just lying there crying until my eyes swelled shut. Nova's funeral was small but crowded. He had touched so many lives. His mom hugged me for a long time. Instead of being angry, which she had every right to be since I still owed her son money, she gave me a tiny glass vial. "He'd want you to have some of his ashes," she said. "I put them in a tree of life necklace and wore it every day. It was all I had left of him. For weeks I moved through life like a zombie. I finally found a job, paid back Nova's mom the $800 plus interest. But nothing filled the Nova-shaped hole in my life." I kept expecting to hear his laugh, his footsteps, the way he'd announce himself by yelling, "It's your favorite person," whenever he walked into my apartment. Then, about 6 weeks after the funeral, my sister called me. "There's this cat that won't leave my backyard," she said. "It's been here for 3 days. I think it's a stray. And? You want me to come get it or something?" I wasn't in the mood for random cat drama. "It's orange, like bright orange, and it keeps looking in my windows like it's looking for someone. I don't know why, but my heart started racing. I'll be right over." I drove to my sister's place in Montclair, about 30 minutes from me. When I got there, she was sitting on her back porch. "It was just here," she said, sounding frustrated. "It keeps coming and going." We waited. About 10 minutes later, this scrawny orange tabby cat walked into the yard like it owned the place. It couldn't have been more than 6 months old. The moment it saw me, it stopped. I've never experienced anything like what happened next. The cat walked straight to me, no hesitation, and jumped into my lap. I'm severely allergic to cats, have been my whole life, so I immediately tensed up, waiting for the sneezing and itching to start. Nothing happened. The cat put its paw directly on my necklace, the one with Nova's ashes, and stared into my eyes. I swear to God I recognized something in those eyes. My sister saw it too. "Holy shit," she whispered. "That's so weird." The cat stayed in my lap for an hour, purring, occasionally batting at the necklace. No matter how I moved, it stayed focused on the ashes. And not once, not a single time, did I sneeze or get itchy or have any allergic reaction whatsoever. I took the cat home that day, named it Nova Cat, unoriginal I know. My landlord doesn't allow pets, but I didn't care. I was ready to move if I had to. The first night with Nova Cat was when I truly accepted what had happened. I was lying in bed, crying about Nova, clutching the necklace, when the cat jumped up beside me. It gently head-butted the hand holding the necklace, then curled up against my chest, right where the necklace rested, as if it was drawn to its own ashes. I know how this sounds. Trust me, I do. If someone told me this story before it happened to me, I'd think they were delusional with grief or desperately seeking meaning in coincidence. But there were too many specific things. 1. I'd never told anyone about Nova's promise to come back as an orange cat. Not my sister, not our mutual friends, no one. 2. My lifelong cat allergy disappeared completely, but only with Nova Cat. I've tested it with other cats since then. Still allergic. 3. Nova Cat has this habit of putting his paw on my shoulder when I'm upset, exactly like Nova used to do. 4. The cat appeared exactly 40 days after Nova's death, which in some cultures is when the soul completes its journey. There were other things too. Nova Cat always gets excited when Nova's favorite songs play. He sits and stares at Nova's photos. He has this way of tilting his head when he looks at me that is so reminiscent of Nova's expression. It's been 6 years now. Nova Cat is still with me, healthy and vibrant. The grief has softened, though I'll always miss Nova's human form. But having this cat, this being that somehow carries his energy, has helped me heal in ways therapy never could. I've told this story to only a few close friends. Some think I found a way to process my grief through this cat. Others believe me completely. My sister, who witnessed that first meeting, has no doubts. As for me, I don't need anyone else to believe it. I know what I've experienced. Nova kept his promise. He found a way back to me, to make sure I knew that energy never dies. It just changes form. Exactly what he always said. I still wear the necklace with his ashes. Nova Cat still paws at it sometimes. And on the anniversary of his death, the cat always spends the entire day sitting by the window, staring at the sky, as if remembering another life. I'm not religious anymore, and I'm still skeptical about a lot of spiritual stuff. But this experience changed me. How could it not? My best friend died, promised to come back as an orange cat, and then he did exactly that. The universe is stranger and more beautiful than we can comprehend. And sometimes, if you're lucky, it gives you a second chance to say all the things you wish you'd said the first time around. I miss you in human form, Nova, but I'm so grateful for this orange cat that carries your spirit. You kept your promise, and it saved my life. Bye-bye. Story 16. I've been camping solo for almost 7 years now, but what happened last summer at Big Meadow changed everything for me. I still camp alone, but I'm not the same person who hiked into that basin with such confidence. I had been planning this trip for months. Work had been brutal, 60-hour weeks, endless meetings, and a boss who thought weekends were optional. I needed to disconnect completely. No cell service, no people, just me and the mountains for 3 days. Big Meadow was perfect, a massive alpine basin surrounded by pine forest, about 11 miles from the nearest trailhead. The ranger at the station raised an eyebrow when I requested a backcountry permit for just myself, but I knew what I was doing. I'd done my research, packed appropriately, and left a detailed itinerary with my brother. The hike in was gorgeous. Mid-July, wildflowers everywhere, and the kind of deep blue sky you only get at elevation. I took my time, stopping to filter water at a creek and eat lunch on a sun-warmed rock. By late afternoon, I reached the meadow and stood at its edge, taking it all in. The basin stretched almost a mile across, tall grass swaying in the breeze. Mountains rose on three sides, and the northern edge, where the trees began again, seemed like the perfect spot to set up camp. I found a small clearing about 30 yards into the trees, close enough to enjoy views of the meadow, but with enough tree cover to block wind and morning sun. The spot was ideal, flat ground, no obvious game trails nearby, and a perfect branch for hanging my food bag. Setting up was routine. I pitched my small one-person tent, one of those ultralight models that weighs almost nothing, inflated my sleeping pad, and laid out my bag. Made dinner on my little stove, just rehydrated pasta, but after the hike it tasted amazing. As the sun started setting, I meticulously packed all my food, toothpaste, deodorant, anything scented, into my bear bag and hung it about 15 feet up and 6 feet out from a sturdy pine, just like I'd done dozens of times before. I sat on a fallen log watching darkness creep across the meadow until the stars came out. The Milky Way was incredible, that thick band of light you never see in the city. No moon that night, which made the stars even brighter. It was exactly what I'd come for. Around 10, I crawled into my tent, read a few pages of my book by headlamp, then turned in. The day's hike had worn me out, and I fell asleep almost immediately. I'm not sure what time it was when I woke up. Maybe 1 in the morning? My watch was somewhere in the pocket of my jacket, and there was no way I was moving to check it, because something was out there, something moving through the tall grass of the meadow. At first, I thought I was dreaming, a soft, rhythmic swishing sound, like something pushing through the grass. Not the random rustling you get with wind. This was deliberate movement, something walking steadily in my direction. I held my breath and listened. The sound stopped, then started again, closer now. Whatever it was definitely heading toward my tent. My first thought was bear, and my heart started hammering so hard I was sure anything within 50 feet could hear it. But the movement seemed too light, too careful for a bear. I lay completely still in my sleeping bag, barely breathing. The footsteps, because that's definitely what they were, continued getting closer, moving from the open meadow into the trees. I strained to hear any snuffling or heavy breathing, any clue as to what kind of animal was approaching, but there was nothing except the soft sound of movement through undergrowth. Then silence. Complete silence for maybe 30 seconds. I started to hope whatever it was had moved on, lost interest. That's when I felt it. A gentle pressure against the side of my tent. Not a bump or a scratch, but a deliberate press, like something was leaning against the thin nylon wall. I could actually see the fabric indent slightly in the darkness. I froze, completely and utterly froze. My brain was screaming at me to do something, make noise, grab my knife from under my pillow, anything, but my body wouldn't respond. I just lay there barely breathing as the pressure moved slowly along the side of my tent. The contact was so light, so careful, that it seemed almost curious rather than aggressive. Like whatever was out there was investigating this strange structure in its territory. The pressing continued around to the foot of my tent, then to the other side. I turned my head fractionally, following the movement, terrified it would suddenly tear through the fabric. The thing about tents is, they're just nylon, ridiculously thin. In that moment, I realized how absurd the whole concept was, thinking this practically transparent shell could protect me from anything that really wanted to get in. It was psychological protection, not physical. And now that psychology was completely shattered, the pressure moved toward the head of my tent, where I was lying. I could hear soft breathing now, not heavy panting like a predator, but quiet, controlled breaths. It was right by my head, maybe 6 inches away, with only that useless layer of fabric between us. I closed my eyes. I'm not religious, but I prayed to anything that might be listening. Please go away. Please don't hurt me. Please. The pressure increased slightly. Then something else, a sound I couldn't immediately identify, a sort of clop or tap against the ground. Then another. The pressure on my tent released. Hooves. Those were hooves. The realization washed over me like ice water. Not a bear or mountain lion, but probably a deer, maybe an elk. My terror receded just slightly, replaced by a different kind of awe. This wild animal had been examining my tent, trying to figure out what I was. I heard it take a few steps away, then stop. I imagined it standing there in the darkness, still watching my tent. After what felt like forever, I heard it move farther away back toward the meadow. The soft swishing of grass gradually faded. I didn't move for at least an hour. Couldn't move. My muscles were locked up from the adrenaline and fear. When I finally did shift position, every sound I made seemed obscenely loud in the quiet night. I didn't sleep again, not really. I drifted in and out, jerking awake at every sound, a pine cone dropping, the wind picking up slightly, distant animal calls I couldn't identify. I kept thinking about how helpless I'd been, how completely at the mercy of whatever decided to visit my campsite. When the first gray light of dawn finally appeared, I unzipped my tent with shaking hands and peered out. The meadow was beautiful in the early morning mist, peaceful in a way that seemed to mock my night of terror. I pulled on my boots and cautiously stepped outside. The forest floor was damp with dew, and there, clear as day around my tent, were deer tracks. Unmistakable hoof prints circling, exactly where I'd felt the pressure against my tent. Relief flooded through me, confirmation that it had just been a curious deer, not something more dangerous. But the relief was short-lived, because the realization that had come to me in the night remained. That thin nylon wouldn't have protected me from anything. Not from a deer's sharp hooves if it had spooked. Not from a bear's claws. Not from anything that actually wanted to harm me. I made coffee with trembling hands, spilling water twice. As I sat drinking it, I tried to talk myself down. It was just a deer. I was fine. Everything was fine. But something fundamental had shifted in me. The wilderness I'd always found so peaceful now felt unpredictable, indifferent to my presence. I had planned to stay 2 more nights, but there was no way I was spending another night in that spot. I seriously considered hiking out completely, but my stubborn pride wouldn't let me. Instead, I broke camp and moved deeper into the trees, about a 1/4 mile away from my original site. I found a spot between 3 large pines, much more enclosed than my previous location. I carefully examined the ground for game trails and found none. This time, when I set up my tent, I tied a small aluminum cook pot to a low branch nearby with some paracord, positioning it so any large animal approaching would likely brush against it. A makeshift alarm system. Childish maybe, but it made me feel marginally better. I spent the day hiking around the basin, trying to recapture the peace I'd felt before. But I kept scanning the tree line, jumping at movements in my peripheral vision. When night came, I reluctantly returned to my tent. I left my headlamp on, hanging from the gear loop at the tent's ceiling. I also kept my knife unsheathed beside my pillow, though I knew it would be useless against anything larger than a squirrel. Every sound that night jolted me awake, a branch creaking in the wind, an owl hooting somewhere nearby, my own breathing, sometimes. I must have drifted off eventually because I woke at dawn, surprised to find light filtering through the tent walls. Nothing had visited in the night. My little alarm hadn't sounded. But it didn't matter. I packed up immediately and hiked out that morning, practically jogging the 11 miles back to my car. It's been over a year now. I still go solo camping. I can't give it up completely. But everything's different. I research campsites obsessively, looking for spots away from game trails and grazing areas. I carry an air horn now. I set up more substantial perimeter alarms. I sleep with one eye open. Some people might think I'm overreacting to an encounter with a deer. Maybe I am. But it wasn't about the deer itself. It was the realization of my complete vulnerability. That moment when I understood that the barrier between me and the wild was psychological, not physical. That if anything at all, decided it wanted in, that barrier would mean nothing. I've never told anyone this story until now. It sounds silly when I try to explain it, being terrified by Bambi. But that night changed how I see the wilderness. Not as something to be conquered or even appreciated from a distance, but as something to be respected, approached with humility, something that allows our presence but could revoke that permission at any moment. Every time I zip up my tent now, I remember those hoof prints circling where I slept, and I wonder what else might come visiting in the night. Story 17. It was supposed to be just another long workday. My company had sent me to handle an emergency electrical issue at a manufacturing plant near Riverton. What was initially described as a quick fix turned into a 13-hour marathon of troubleshooting, replacing components, and testing systems. By the time I finished, it was already past 9 in the evening, and I was absolutely drained. I remember standing in the parking lot looking up at the sky. Dark clouds were rolling in fast, and the wind was picking up. The plant manager warned me about potential severe weather, saying there were tornado warnings for counties to the north. I checked the radar on my phone, and it looked like I might be able to outrun the worst of it if I left immediately. I had about 250 miles to cover to get home, and I just wanted to be in my own bed. The company F-150 I was driving had a full tank, and I figured I'd stop somewhere along the way if the weather got too nasty. The first 20 miles or so were fine, just increasing wind and some light rain. The radio kept cutting in with weather alerts, but nothing directly in my path yet. That stretch of highway between Riverton and Oakdale is notoriously empty. It's just miles of darkness broken up by the occasional abandoned gas station or farmhouse. No street lights, no businesses open past sundown, and on that night, no other cars. I remember thinking how alone I was out there, how if anything happened, it would be a long time before someone came along. About 40 miles into my drive, the weather turned violent. The rain became a downpour, and then without warning, hail started hammering down on the truck. Not small hail either. Some pieces were the size of golf balls, slamming into the roof and hood with sounds like gunshots. I couldn't see more than 10 feet ahead, even with the high beams on. I spotted what looked like a wider shoulder area and pulled over, figuring it was better to wait out the worst rather than risk driving through it. I put the truck in park, but kept the engine running and the lights on. The hail was deafening inside the cab. That's when I felt it, this weird pressure change. My ears popped, and the hairs on my arms stood up. Anyone who's lived in tornado country knows that feeling. That sensation when the air itself seems to get heavy and change somehow. I unbuckled my seatbelt and tried to scan, the horizon for any funnel clouds, but it was pitch black outside except for my headlights illuminating the curtain of hail. I rolled down the window just a crack to listen for that freight train sound people talk about with tornadoes, but all I could hear was the pounding of ice on metal. The wind suddenly died down, like completely. The hail stopped too, just stopped dead. It went from chaos to complete stillness in seconds. That's not normal. That's not how storms work. The sudden silence was more unnerving than the storm had been. I remember checking the time on the dashboard, 11:27 p.m. I remember because I was calculating how many more hours of driving I had ahead of me, wondering if I should find a motel instead. I turned toward the driver's side window to check the sky again, and that's when I saw it. Him. Whatever the fuck it was. There was a face pressed against my window, not just any face. This thing was tall enough that it had to bend down to look into the truck. Its skin was so pale, it was almost blue in the glow from my dashboard lights. The skin looked stretched too tight over its skull, like it might tear at any moment. But the eyes and the mouth, Jesus. The eyes were deep set, shadowed, but somehow reflecting light like an animal's. And its mouth, it had this smile that stretched literally from ear to ear, filled with jagged, crooked teeth that didn't look human at all. They were spaced wrong, pointed in places. It wasn't moving, just staring, with that grotesque grin pressed against my window, so close I could see fog forming on the glass from its breath. I'm not ashamed to admit I screamed, full-throated, primal scream. I jerked away so hard I slammed into the passenger door. My hand went for the gear shift without me even thinking about it, and I fumbled to get the truck into drive, and in that instant, I swear this is true, it was gone. Not like it ran away or moved out of sight, it literally vanished between one blink and the next. 1 second staring at me with that impossible grin, the next second nothing but darkness outside my window. I floored it. The tires spun on the wet asphalt before catching, and the truck fishtailed before straightening out. I didn't care about the hail anymore, or potential tornadoes, or the fact that I was going nearly 90 on a slick road with poor visibility. All I knew was that I needed to get the fuck away from whatever I'd just seen. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep the wheel straight. Cold sweat soaked through my shirt. I kept checking my mirrors, convinced I'd see that face again, looming up in the darkness behind me. I drove like that for about 30 minutes, not daring to stop, barely slowing for curves. Eventually, I saw the lights of a truck stop up ahead and pulled in, parking directly under one of the bright overhead lights. I sat there for a long time, engine idling, trying to make sense of what had happened. Had I fallen asleep at the wheel for a few seconds? Was it some kind of waking dream caused by exhaustion? But it had felt so real. The way the glass fogged where its mouth was pressed against it, the way its eyes had locked with mine. Then I remembered the cameras. Our company trucks have dash cams and rear-facing cameras that record continuously, standard insurance policy. If there was really something outside my window, the driver's side camera would have caught it. My hands were still trembling as I accessed the footage on my phone. I skipped to the timestamp from when I'd pulled over and watched. There was the storm, the hail, me pulling onto the shoulder. I could see my movements inside the cab, turning to look out the window, then my obvious panic reaction, the truck speeding away. But there was nothing there. No pale figure, no grinning face, nothing but empty darkness outside my window. I watched it 3 times, focusing on different areas of the frame, looking for any movement in the shadows, any distortion, that could explain what I saw. There was nothing. I called my wife, not telling her what happened, just saying the storm was bad and I was going to get a motel room for the night. I couldn't face the idea of driving another 3 hours in the dark, not after that. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that grin, those teeth. I kept the TV on full volume and every light in the motel room blazing until dawn. The next morning, I took a different route home, adding nearly an hour to my drive just to avoid that stretch of highway. In the daylight, with other cars around me and the radio playing, I almost convinced myself it had been hallucination from fatigue. Almost. But here's the thing that keeps eating at me. I've had plenty of late nights on the road before. I've been tired. I've been so exhausted I could barely keep my eyes open. Never once did I hallucinate something like that. Never once did I see something so detailed, so vivid, so fucking terrifying that it made me question my own sanity. And there's something else, something I didn't tell anyone, not even my wife. When I was reviewing the footage the next day on my larger tablet screen, I noticed something in the final frames before I sped away. It's barely visible, and you might miss it if you weren't looking for it. A slight distortion in the air next to my window. Not a figure, not a face, but almost like the kind of heat mirage you see on hot asphalt in summer. Except it was cold and raining that night. I've gone back to that footage dozens of times since then. Sometimes I convince myself there's nothing there. Other times, I swear I can make out the vague outline of a tall, thin shape. I don't know what I encountered on that empty stretch of Arkansas highway. I don't know if it was something supernatural or if my brain, pushed to its limits by exhaustion and stress, conjured up a waking nightmare. What I do know is that I refuse to drive that road after dark ever again. I've turned down 2 jobs that would have taken me back to Riverton, claiming scheduling conflicts. Because all I can think about is how isolated that highway is. How if something had happened to me there, if that thing had been real and had intentions beyond scaring the life out of me, no one would have known. I might have just disappeared into the Arkansas night, another missing person statistic. To this day, whenever it storms at night, I double-check the locks on my doors and windows. And no matter how tired I get on long drives now, I never ever pull over on empty stretches of road. I'll drive until I find lights, other people, civilization. Because sometimes I still feel like I'm being watched. And sometimes, just as I'm falling asleep, I think I catch a glimpse of something pale moving at the edge of my vision, something with a smile that's just a little too wide. Story 18. I've never been one to believe in the paranormal. Ghosts, spirits, all of that stuff. I always thought it was just people's imaginations running wild or their minds playing tricks on them. That was until 2 years ago when I stayed at Hampton Court Palace while visiting London for work. What happened that night completely changed everything I thought I knew about the world. I was excited about staying at Hampton Court, honestly. It's this massive Tudor palace where Henry VIII lived, and it's stunning. All red brick and ornate chimneys. I'm a bit of a history buff, so when my company booked me accommodation there, they have converted apartments for guests. I was thrilled. I knew about the ghost stories, of course. The palace is supposedly one of the most haunted places in England. The Grey Lady, Catherine Howard's ghost, supposedly running through the haunted gallery, screaming for mercy before her execution. But I laughed it all off. Good stories for the tourists, right? When I arrived, the staff member who checked me mentioned that a family had left earlier that day, a day before their booking ended. She didn't say why, but she had this weird look on her face when she told me. I didn't think much of it at the time. People change plans all the time. My room was beautiful but odd. It was in one of the older sections of the palace, with these thick stone walls that must have been several feet thick. The strangest thing was, there were no windows, just a skylight way up in the ceiling. It made the room feel isolated, like being in a beautiful box. One wall backed against what the staff called a service room, basically a glorified storage locker with some old furniture and supplies. When I peeked in earlier in the day, there was nothing there except an old palace cat sleeping on a chair. The staff mentioned that room also contained a door to what used to be a tunnel that led down to the River Thames. Apparently, it was how people would sometimes arrive at the palace by boat centuries ago. The tunnel was sealed up now, they assured me. After a day of meetings in London, I got back to my room around 10 in the evening. I'm not usually nervous about staying alone, but something about the room felt, I don't know, heavy? Like the air was thick somehow. I convinced myself it was just the age of the building and the lack of windows making the ventilation poor. I'm a bit of a safety freak when staying in unfamiliar places, so I double-checked that my room door was locked properly. I even wedged my suitcase against it, a habit from too many business trips to dodgy hotels. I also put my phone, a glass of water, and a small candle on the bedside table. The room had electric lights, but the stone walls made it feel like the darkness was just waiting in the corners, ready to swallow everything up once the lights went out. Before turning in, I heard someone talking in the hallway, two of the night staff. They didn't realize I was listening, but I caught snippets about the family that had left early. Apparently, their little girl, maybe 7 or 8, had woken up screaming in the middle of the night about the sad lady in the dark. The parents couldn't calm her down, and they checked out first thing in the morning. I felt a little chill when I heard that, but I dismissed it. Kids have nightmares, especially in strange places with lots of scary historical stories. I went to bed around 11, feeling exhausted. The bed was surprisingly comfortable for being in such an old building. I fell asleep quickly, but I didn't stay that way. I woke up suddenly, completely alert. You know that feeling when you go from deep sleep to wide awake in a split second? Like that. The room was pitch black, no street lights coming through windows because there weren't any, and the skylight just showed a tiny patch of dark night sky. My phone said it was 4:17 in the morning. What woke me was a sound, a door creaking like old wood groaning against wood. Then there was a heavy thud from the direction of that service room next door. My first thought was that the cat had knocked something over, but then I remembered that the door to that room had been locked when I checked earlier. I reached for the matches to light my candle, and that's when it happened. I felt something touch my hand, not violently, but firmly, like someone gently but insistently stopping me from moving. It wasn't painful or aggressive, but it was unmistakable. A cool pressure around my wrist, like fingers, human fingers. I yanked my hand back and sat bolt upright in bed. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I stared into the darkness, trying to see something, anything, but there was nothing there. Nothing physical, anyway. "Hello?" I whispered, feeling stupid even as I said it. No response, of course. Then I noticed something strange. There was a faint glow coming from the foot of my bed. Not bright like a light, more like the way moonlight looks when it filters through fog. As my eyes adjusted, I could make out a figure standing there. It was a woman, tall and slender, with this incredibly sad face. She was wearing clothes that looked like they were from centuries ago, A long, dark gown with these puffy sleeves that tapered at the wrists. I later learned they're called highway sleeves. And some kind of shawl draped over her shoulders. Her hair was styled in this old-fashioned way, pulled back tightly from her face with some kind of decorative pins. The strangest thing was that I could see through her. Not completely. She wasn't like a projected image or anything so simple. It was more like she was made of light and shadow at the same time, with this faint luminescence outlining her form. The wall behind her was visible but distorted, like looking through frosted glass. I couldn't move. I couldn't even scream. I just sat there, clutching my blanket up to my chin like a child, watching this apparition. Because that's what she was. I knew it instantly, with a certainty that bypassed all my rational thinking. The woman's face was the worst part. She looked utterly heartbroken. Not angry or threatening, just filled with this bottomless grief that made my chest ache just looking at her. Her eyes were fixed on something I couldn't see, not meeting mine. Then she moved. Not toward me, thank God, but toward the wall that separated my room from the service room. There were folding doors there that had been sealed up. You could still see the outline in the wall. She moved straight through them, like they weren't even there. I found my voice somehow. "Do you need help?" I asked. Ridiculous question, but what do you say to a ghost? She didn't respond to my voice at all. Instead, she raised her hands, which were visibly trembling, and then she did something I'll never forget. She sank slowly to her knees, right there by the sealed doors. She covered her face with those trembling hands and bowed her head, like she was praying, or like she was overwhelmed with grief. It was the posture of someone completely broken by sorrow. I had this overwhelming urge to get up and go to her, to comfort her somehow. But before I could move, she vanished. Not gradually, like fading away. She was just gone, between one blink and the next. The glow disappeared with her, plunging the room back into darkness. But the feeling didn't go away. The room felt charged with emotion, like the air after a thunderstorm. I could still feel her sadness, her desperation. It was suffocating. I switched on every light in the room and stayed awake until dawn, sitting with my back against the headboard. I didn't dare close my eyes again. When morning finally came, I packed my things and checked out immediately. The woman at the desk didn't seem surprised. She didn't ask why I was leaving early, just nodded like she'd been expecting it. "Did you see her?" she asked quietly, glancing around to make sure no one else could hear. I hesitated, then nodded. "The kneeling woman," she said, not a question. "By the old passage door?" My blood went cold. "You know about her?" "She's been seen before. Not often, but always in that room. Always by that sealed passage." She lowered her voice further. "They say she was waiting for someone who never came back. A lover who was supposed to meet her through that secret tunnel. Some say he was killed trying to reach her. I don't know if that story is true. What I do know is what I saw wasn't my imagination. It wasn't a dream or a hallucination. It was deliberate, not just some random spooky encounter, but a woman reliving what might have been the worst moment of her life, maybe her death. I don't think she was trying to scare me or even knew I was there. She was caught in her own moment of profound suffering, doomed to kneel by that passage forever, waiting. I've tried researching the history of that part of the palace, trying to find out who she might have been. There are records of secret love, affairs, of clandestine meetings, of people vanishing without explanation, but nothing conclusive that points to my kneeling woman. I still can't explain exactly what I saw that night. Was it a traditional ghost? or more like an imprint of extreme emotion somehow burned into the fabric of that place? Whatever secrets that passage holds, whatever happened to her, that silent, kneeling woman seems destined to relive her moment of breaking for eternity. I don't laugh at ghost stories anymore.